Yeah, this is always the fun part. Get wrapped up.
It's a happy hour music.
Right.
Close and feel like we're getting there. Yeah, definitely. Very sexy, the other lost it. That's not bad.
All right.
Hey. Well, hey. I'm good. Yeah, I wanted to know hard copies in case they want to take it out.
That's nice.
It was our-
And then I see that
So I'm done.
there was half a dozen slides that were completed after this presentation. That we did today. So that's what those are.
Thank you.
Doing over there, I just-
Here we have full battery.
Oh. Yeah. No.
Ran out of there. Did need them actually.
Yeah.
Talking. And the other, the last one, sent it off. It was probably.
Oh, wow. That's- Yeah.
So yeah, that was.
You got an extra, Dave?
Yeah.
Ooh,
You're up there.
Um,
Oh, you're answering the cab up there?
Do you know?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That I'm
That's-
downstairs?
No, I didn't know that.
I thought you were gonna be
Driving home that way.
The older I get, the
I'm just,
Hey, casual Wednesday, isn't it?
well, I've been downstairs, no
That's-
boxes all day.
stuff, so. Yeah.
See what you do.
Yeah.
Thank you, sir.
Those slides came out after that package.
Rather have
Okay.
close
Thank
encounters
you.
with
I'll be downstairs.
animals, seeing them.
Can I come join you? Yeah.
Once I started archery.
I don't. Something on the side of my belly sticks out.
Well, suck it in, Dave. A couple chairs back further. Nobody. Matthew sent me a message today to keep that thing on them. I'm very close.
More on Friday.
Okay.
Tune something.
Yeah. it's-
Yeah, there's gonna be something.
I love it.
From using.
Yeah, and I think you had some spaces for some dates in there that we now have.
Yeah.
Great place. Gosh, hey, Dave, sorry you've been sick.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was gonna ask if, since you're talking more, do you want me to sit over here out of the way? That's what I'll move over there. I suspect that there'd be more reason for Dave to confer with you than me.
Yep.
So.
Sure.
Actually, you want me to just advance the slides for you, Deb, or do you? you've got more slides too. Do you want to hand the slides? I can
Sure.
I'll just put the laptop. I'll just, I mean, yeah, I'm happy to do it, but I know, sometimes it's a pain to have to keep telling somebody, next slide, next slide. I'll just hand it over to you.
That sounds good.
Nothing better to do.
This is the-
Yes, and the bathrooms are the ones that are downstairs.
Okay. So I can borrow this?
Yeah, keep it and throw it away if you want, or. No.
You know what?
The last time I sent a message was to let them know. Saying,
How we doing?
are you fine?
Doing?
He told me. We talked about it. A couple days ago.
Rod,
Oh, okay, I thought it was stuff that I'd left for you. Pick that up earlier.
this gave one of these. For staff.
Mayor, you're quite the king of the gifts, aren't you? Or gifs, or whatever they call them.
So Monday, the second, we could talk about it Monday, and usually the legislative.
What is that they have?
I'll be honest. I just got caught up going out Saturday night. I won't be back till Thursday or Friday probably. But I think I have 5 copies here.
We can. This will be part of his manager's report, probably.
Feel I set out here.
Okay.
You run a pretty close competition between who's the king of the gifts or gifs or whatever you call those things.
He is good. We,
How good this was, and then he sent me another one.
yeah, it is it makes my week sometimes. Rich is really good.
What's it, the picture of the computer, that one?
Probably under-
It could have been me in grade school.
I think it was.
It would have been abacus.
Rachel sent that to me and
And our city manager report. I'll talk with him and see where. He's- Darcy. I'm not sure about. Just a reminder out.
Okay.
Days ago is when I.
Did before, I'll start with a couple of comments in those.
Okay. Do you know if Scott is back in town?
Oh, no.
And then so you, and then
And then
Hear from you.
most of it, yep, so I've got about 2 minutes and then
I've got
and then you get
50.
the next, the next.
so, yeah,
Which-
just,
Number.
which, yeah.
Oh, here.
Um,
Don't bring about.
be done by.
I don't even know where it came from.
Apparently I've been moved.
And we've.
Yes. Coffee with the mayor, huh?
What? These
Coffee with the mayor, huh?
pages, I,
In the newspaper.
Yeah, I mean, they're just
Front page of the Gorge News,
comparison.
I'd say.
The mayor.
narrative.
Haven't,
Okay.
somebody's
Yeah,
having,
so-
what? You did an interview
Counselor McLaughlin is on his way in as we speak. He should be here any second. We'll once again call the meeting to order and we'll do. Please call the roll.
Counselor McLaughlin,
I'm present barely.
Counselor Long,
Present.
Counselor Richardson,
Present.
Counselor Randall is absent. Counselor Runyon,
Present.
remains.
Present. Item 3 is Pledge of Allegiance. I'd like to ask our council president, Tim McLaughlin, to please lead us in the pledge.
I will gladly do that. Please rise. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Approval of the agenda. Do I have a motion to approve the agenda?
So moved.
Is there a second?
I'll second that.
It's been moved by Counselor Richardson, seconded by Counselor Long to approve the agenda. Is there any discussion? All those in favor, please say aye.
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 Any opposed? Motion carries. Item 5A, Water Utility Financial Analysis Presentation and Discussion. Turn it over to our Director of Public Works, Dave Anderson. Mr. Anderson.
Thank you, Honorable Mayor, members of council. We're meeting tonight in the third of our 3 planned work sessions on the financial aspects of our Water Master Plan update. We have again with us tonight Brian Ginter and Emily Flock with Consor, who's our primary consultant on the Water Master Plan update, and Deb Glardy, who's the financial sub-consultant working for Consor on the financial aspects. I had distributed in front of your chairs the same copy of the information that was distributed last week. So the thicker report is the same thing that you may have received last week. And then there's another smaller packet. There's only 6 slides. These slides are some additional comparative rate information that was completed after those packets were distributed. And we'll touch on those as the presentation goes along. We will begin tonight with a very brief review of where we've been. And just to provide and refresh some memories on the context. Then we're going to have a presentations that outline some different rate scenarios. It is our goal tonight to get some specific direction from council on which rate scenario you prefer. And that is, something just changed, and that is the scenario that will be included in the water master plan as it's put out for public comment and then brought back to the city council for a public hearing and consideration for adoption. With that, unless there's any questions, I'd like to go ahead and turn it over to Brian Ginter.
Dave, if we approve the water master plan or adopt it, does that automatically adopt water rate increases?
We
as well?
would, with the adoption of the plan, then we would bring a resolution to the council to implement the rates.
All right, I'm going to jump right in and really quickly get out of the way because the meat of the presentation is going to be from Deb. So just a quick overview. We'll just do a refresh on the capital improvement plan draft that's going to be in the master plan to inform the reason for all of this discussion around rates, and then hand it over to Deb to cover financial analysis and policy discussion, wrap up with some quick next steps. So this was in the previous presentation. It's really the top priorities in the draft CIP, the reminder. It's a significant investment in the first 10 years, almost $165 million. What's new from last time, and you'll see it as Deb goes through her presentation, is that we've had discussions with the EPA about the WIFIA loan program, have a better understanding of how that might be structured, and that's reflected in the analysis. And what we have here is in the colors blue and pink, a phase 1 and a phase 2 WIFIA loan as a way to finance these major projects. So the blue projects, the 4 big ones, the treatment plant replacement, that's the large initial project, aquifer storage and recovery program planning for a future expansion of the Crow Creek Dam, and if successful, expansion of the ASR program would all be in a first WIFIA loan. And then the other major projects, the transmission main replacements between Wicks water treatment plant and town, and distribution piping improvements in the city would be part of a second WIFIA loan program that would follow a little later. And so those are really the significant projects that we're talking about that drive investments early in the CIP.
I trust the, do you want us to interrupt with questions or?
Please go ahead. Yes.
You've assumed some inflation in those, especially the last two categories.
Yes. Yep. So in the master plan document itself, the engineering analysis is all done in current dollars. And then as Deb does the financial analysis, she's got assumptions about inflation that are included throughout. So we baseline to today's dollars, but it is built into the financial analysis. And I'm going to turn it over to Deb.
Okay. All right, so just a little bit of recap about the financial analysis framework and the objectives. We are coming to you with all the pieces tonight. We didn't talk specifically about the systems development charges last time, but we provided that information.
Amy, can you just a little bit?
Closer? Is that better?
That's better. Yes.
Thank you. So the objectives are to fund the capital improvements and the ongoing operation and maintenance, and to do so in a way that's equitable and defensible in terms of both existing and future development paying for its share of the project improvements, and within the ratepayer customers, the different types of services that you provide. The rate design is the last piece, and in rate design, we also often refer to rate design as it's both art and science, because certainly there are some standard industry practices that help to inform how costs should be recovered, but there's a lot of flexibility to also reflect local policy objectives. So we'll talk about that as we go forward. Okay. So a little bit of recap here again. The numbers did change that are highlighted, and always happy when numbers go down slightly. So thank Brian for that and his team. But there were some reductions in the cost estimates, I think, for the treatment plant. So you'll see some of the reduction in like the initial WIFIA loan amounts and things that were anticipated to be funding the treatment projects. Those numbers have decreased slightly. But the capital improvements dominate the financial plan over the next 20 years. And as was mentioned, inflation is included in all the numbers that I'm going to present tonight. Last time we came to you with no inflation and with inflation. It's all baked into the numbers this time around to reduce the number of scenarios and reflect the reality of what the city will be facing. And the big issue is that the current rates and SDCs have very limited funding capacity. The city does have the advantage of the anticipated growth in water sales that will help to increase the funding capacity for capital improvements over the planning period. And there are some opportunities to leverage federal funding and local revenue sources, the WIFIA being the federal and the SIP funds, City County Strategic Investment Program. Next slide, please.
I got a question. I took that 13 million per year in inflation and divided that by 203 million and came up with 6.4%. Is that an appropriate way to look at the rate of inflation that you might have assumed?
The inflation is 3.5% that we've assumed per year, and it based on the sequencing of the projects. So, some of the projects are front-loaded, others are further out in the plan.
Yeah.
So
Okay, and then
that factors into it.
the chart on the right shows projected revenue of $6 million for 24-25.
Correct. Roughly $6 million funded by SDCs and reserves. And that's showing that it's mostly covering just operating costs.
Yeah, and the operating costs are around 7.5 million. Right.
Well, the purple is the operating expenses. The dark blue is the debt service, your existing debt service. So that is the all-in.
Yeah, I should have said total expenses.
Yes,
So as it
exactly.
stands now, there's a 1.5 million.
You have been drawing down your reserves to pay for annual expenses.
Okay.
Yes. Okay. So what the financial analysis does is to estimate the revenue slope, which is the series of rate increases that are anticipated to fund the projects, as well as the ongoing operation and maintenance. And to give you an idea of order of magnitude, what potentially you're looking at for this capital improvement plan. We have done some refinements of the capital financing plan since we met with you last. We'll talk about that. There's still a lot of unknowns in terms of what the ultimate financing package that the city can enter into, hopefully primarily with WIFIA and other funding sources for the match. And there's the uncertainty around the industrial growth. So we've tried to be a moderate level of risk in terms of not the worst case, not the best case, but some medium case. So that's what we hope that these numbers represent.
I want to point out that Councilor Randall is zoomed in on us. So welcome, Councilor Randall.
May I? Can you give us a qualitative sense, I guess, of the likelihood of getting access to WIFIA?
Yeah, that's addressed on this next slide here.
Thank you.
Perfect segue. So we did do an initial meeting with a WIFIA representative just to confirm that these types of projects would likely be eligible, to confirm that the small system eligibility, the 80% funding level was realistic, and they did confirm that. Recently, we just saw too that the city of Sandy, Oregon, also entered into a loan with WIFIA for wastewater system improvements, and they were funded at 80%. They match their local match, so the other 20%, they're using, I think, SRF state, loan program for that match. We've assumed at this point a revenue bond. If you are also able to combine it with SRF funds, there's a potential for even lower interest costs, extending the payback period. So again, kind of middle of the road here of what we're anticipating. But the primary framework of the 80% assumption, and that the projects didn't raise any red flags as not being the type of projects that WIFIA would fund. We were able to check all those boxes. The representative did confirm that the current interest rates are still quite high, 4.15%, high relative to previous very low interest rates. We've assumed 3.5% for the purposes of this analysis. It's anticipated that rates will continue to, that the Fed will continue to decrease interest rates, which do directly impact the WIFIA interest rates, but at what pace, we don't know. They did suggest that we assume 2 separate loans, as Brian mentioned, and that there is significant flexibility in how the city repays those funds, which will be further explored as you move into the letter of interest and then hopefully an invitation to apply. So it's a multi-step process. We make the initial outreach, but then the city has to follow up with a letter of interest. And it's not until about 30% of project design, when the costs are more firm, that they will enter into an agreement.
Do we know what the municipal bond market is? I mean, take it that's higher than 4.15.
Yes, yes, it is. Did you want to say something, Dave?
And perhaps also to Councilor Richardson's question, the other thing that we learned during this consultative call with WIFIA was that the program is no longer competitive. You just apply and the money is awarded as long as the program's there. So that was, I think, new information for us. That certainly the program, when it was originally initiated, it was competitive. So to your point of what are the chances of getting it, they're very good.
It sounds like the sooner we apply, the better the chance.
Yes, with the caveat that, as she mentioned, they want a project to be designed to about 30% level, so the costs are pretty well firm. So we've got some work to do on the front end and some funds to accrue to be able to pay for that 30% design work, especially as relates to the water treatment plant replacement.
Thank you. Can I just go over the graph? Sorry, I don't have page numbers, the page that we're on, and just make sure I'm looking at the numbers correctly. There it is, page 9. So the current thinking or current analysis, please, correct me please if I'm wrong, but I just want to go through a couple lines. Current analysis suggests costs will be about 256 million for the full package of planned projects, with WIFIA covering about 129 of it, and then 2 rounds of bonds that we would go out for in the order of 68 million.
Correct.
Thank you.
And as we said, those could be actually loans depending on what's available at the time, but that's all to be further evaluated as you get closer to entering into that agreement. Any other questions on that?
One last quick question in terms of like timing and when we pursue a WIFIA package, we would keep an eye on what the Fed's doing, right? And if we are anticipating a couple cuts, we may wait for those to happen. And then is there a timing component there?
You want to address that from a project standpoint?
Sure. Yep.
Balance
Yes.
those two.
Yeah, definitely. And the one thing about the WIFIA program is there is a one-time opportunity to renegotiate to current interest rates. So you also have that flexibility during the life of a loan. So it's not a lot of risk to moving forward once you're ready. The biggest thing is they want to have some cost certainty so that you're building appropriate contingencies in, because once you close, that sets the dollar amount.
Perfect. Thank you.
And just a reminder or new information for anybody who's just tuning in, that one of the main advantages of the WIFIA program is that, and also true of other federal funding options, is that you don't have to start paying until the project is completed, which with a project that spans several years, in this case, that is significant. You do accrue the interest, but repayment is flexible. Okay, let's move on. This just gives you a little bit of idea of the spend down that's anticipated for construction funding, the projects, the big spikes there are related to those treatment projects. And this is also to give some indication about the SIP funding. So the assumption here is a 3 million SIP, which is shown as kind of that teal color, one of the bars. It's absolutely critical that the city have some funding up front to do the design for these projects. As we mentioned, WIFIA wants that work to be done and a better idea of the cost estimates prior to inking the agreement. So that's some funds that will need to be made available. As I mentioned, there's very little capacity right now in the rates to pay for any much above the operation and maintenance costs. And there are other capital improvement projects that aren't part of the WIFIA package that are anticipated in these earlier years. So the SIP funding would be critical to help funding that project design, paying for any interest during construction, and those non-WIFIA projects in the short term. Okay.
So if I read this correctly, from 2000 fiscal 25 through fiscal 30, we will not require a bond sale to make up the, to match the required money until 2031, which is when we would sell revenue bonds.
Exactly. And that's a really great thing to be able to go that long without having to issue something like a revenue bond where you have to start repaying immediately. So that is another thing actually that we confirmed with the WIFIA representative, that the match, the 80%, is not an annual match. So you don't have to, each year you have construction costs, you don't have to cover 20% of those. WIFIA will pay, that can be a cumulative thing, and then you can use your other match mechanism to fund the last 20%, kind of that last increment. So that's another real advantage of that program. And so this is structured to making that assumption that you defer that other mechanism until the end of the project, and you use SIP to fund other master plan projects that aren't part of the WIFIA package. And as you begin to phase in rates to build to pay for the debt service and to fund the other costs that are needed.
So we're getting sufficient revenue in 31 to make up for the fact that we have such a gap in fiscal 32?
Well, yeah. So that's the idea, is that you would issue debt. So remember, you're getting WIFIA proceeds, the orange, and then yes, the combination of the blue, which is the assumed to be the revenue bonds, and rate increases would fund those additional capital improvement projects costs and the debt service.
Is the SIP included in the blue, or where's?
SIP is the turquoise. It's that kind of small second bar. It starts with the purple, which is the rate funded, and you can see how that starts to escalate. And then the turquoise is the SIP, which is assumed to be constant throughout at $3 million.
Sorry, I jumped. Got it.
Okay, let's move on to the next slide. So this next slide then shows you from the rate funded improvements perspective. So this is the estimated revenue slope, or the rate increases under the $3 million SIP low industrial growth assumption. And you can see that at this point, I haven't assumed any increase in fiscal year 24-25. I think we talked a little bit about last time that it would be helpful to do something before the end of the fiscal year. Both, that means that you're not implementing a rate increase at the peak water use period, and it gets a jump on some of these costs. So the timing is to be determined, and we still want some feedback on that. But this gives you a sense of the low industrial scenario, 7.3% rate increases per year that would be really ramping up that blue, that turquoise, which in this case is the assumed contribution from rates, the pay-as-you-go capital that goes to fund the debt service and the capital projects.
The next page shows high industrial use.
Yes.
What's the difference and how do we predict?
I'll let Brian, well, we can go to the next slide. And yeah, it makes about a 2 percentage point difference in the rate increase. So it's 5.3%. I'll let you all address the issue of the assumptions.
So we worked with your major industrial customer to understand what they projected for future demands. And then we made some adjustments downward to anticipate that there could be reductions, just so that we had a conservative number, recognizing that it doesn't change the improvements that are needed. I think we talked about last time, most of your improvements are driven by the need for replacement or renewal more than the capacity. And so we just lowered their demand forecast a bit, capture the possibility that there would be reduced revenue. And I don't all offhand, I don't know if you know the specific reduction amount.
Half?
Half of what
Oh,
they
like Google.
projected. Talking about Google. So about half of what was projected.
So how much of this industrial use is Google compared to the rest of the industries? I mean,
For this analysis, nearly all the industrial use that we're considering is from Google. And I would just add a little bit of context. From experience, we have found that a lot of times in our conversations with us, they will give us a bigger number, an optimistic number, thinking that they're going to ramp up operations at a faster rate, and they want to make sure we've got the water available to accommodate that. In reality, sometimes that use ramps up slower. That's what we've tried to account for in the low industrial use, is if things come online and their water consumption increases at a slower rate, that we have a rate scenario to anticipate that.
Do you have any thoughts on when we, and maybe this is not the appropriate time, but I'm curious if you have any thoughts on whether were we to use the low industrial use assumptions and the 7.3 rate increase over, I think it's 13 years, were we to see in reality a high industrial use? Do you have any thoughts on whether we bank the difference in the water rates or reduce them accordingly? Or pay off something faster?
Yeah.
Or
Well, so until the capital financing package is set in stone, there's a lot of uncertainty in this. And so I would suggest that when the council consider these projections for your initial rate increase, and whether you want to go 5 or 7 or 6, somewhere in between, after having made the decision about SIP and how much of that money is going to be allocated to water infrastructure, then selecting where you're going to start with that next rate increase. And then when you go to submit for WIFIA after the 30% design period, you're going to need to submit financials as part of that. And so these projections will need to be updated at that time to reflect the final project costs, the interest rate at the time for WIFIA, what you decide is going to be your repayment structuring of that debt. Then I think at that point, you'll want to consider a multi-year rate increase and at that point, you'll have a better sense of what's happening with your industrial demand as well. So that's what I would suggest. Do you want, is that okay? Okay, I think that, okay. Yep.
so on page 11, for example, we need, according to this, and I understand there's uncertainty, but we need a 7.3% rate increase effective fiscal year 25 through fiscal year 38, plus $3 million in SIP revenue to pay the costs of operating the water system, assuming low industrial use. That's
Correct. It actually starts in fiscal year 26 on this chart.
on
Yes.
page 12.
Mhm.
Rate increases of 5.3% plus $3 million in SIP revenue to pay the costs of operating the water system, assuming a high industrial rate.
Correct. Yep.
Why does on page 12, why does it go down from 5.3% in fiscal 40 to 4.3% in fiscal 41?
So you're looking at the high industrial use there.
Page 12, yeah.
Yeah, it's just the fact that you have to ramp up based on when we have projected that the debt service will need to start being repaid, the slope has to be a little steeper initially. And then from there, it's kind of, inflationary increases plus some additional capital. But the assumption is that your rates will already be producing enough to pay for the ongoing debt service and capital.
Which would allow us to lower the.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yep.
We keep saying industrial, but you're suggesting rate increases across the board, residential and industrial, and both at the same rate?
We're going to get into that in the second part of the presentation about who pays how much of that overall. This is the overall system revenue increase.
I just didn't want to get it mixed.
Absolutely. Okay. So let's go then. Yeah. So this table just is then, we've made the assumption about the 3 million SIP funding considerations. But as I mentioned, and that's going to be important to meeting both providing some funds for the project design and initial upfront costs and ongoing other capital improvement projects that are not part of the WIFIA package. The $3 million, if that's not coming from SIP, that represents a 46% rate increase, because the current revenue from rates is about $6 million. So 6.6 as what's shown in the table. And so you can see what kind of percentage increases. So the second set of numbers, annual SIP general fund contribution is 0 compared to the 3 million in the top two. And you can see that that would require significantly higher rate increases if that funding mechanism is not included in this package.
Let me just double underline this for my own understanding. The point here is if we do not dedicate $3 million of SIP to it, we have to raise rates cumulatively 50%, 46%.
Basically.
It's got to come from
yeah,
rates or SIP.
Exactly.
All right.
That's exactly right. And the next two graphs just show that, it wouldn't have to happen all at once. We can go, but it would happen quickly. It would be swift and painful. So you can see in this chart, it's a 27.5% increase followed by a 10% increase and then dropping to 7.5% for some years. So that's assuming the low industrial. And then if you go to the next chart, under the high, it's still pretty significant. It's a 23% rate increase in the first year, and then 8.5, followed by the 5.5. So you would need immediate, very significant rate increases in the first 2 years in order to rapidly get up to a level that would compensate for not the loss of the SIP, but foregoing the SIP for the water system. Any other questions on that piece? Okay.
One for Matthew, actually, not to put you on the spot, but kind of tough.
Oh, you're asking him.
What's a reasonable expectation, or I should say, what's a reasonable estimate or guess, conservative model for SIP per year?
So this is actually something that we've been looking into in preparation for the SIP work session that's coming up in November. And so some of the staff work that we've been doing is to look at certain assumptions to try and give us a ballpark based on what the high industrial user has, or the industrial user has stated publicly about the value of some of their data centers. What's been reported numerous times is 600 million in terms of a given data center. I must stress that we need to, be very cautious and mindful about what it may actually be once the data centers are completed.
Understood.
But if you use that value and back it into the SIP formulas that we have, with several assumptions, we're in the ballpark with what could be contributed from the guaranteed annual payment component. So that's not the property tax component. That's not the community service fee component. That's the guaranteed annual payment component, which is split between the city and county. That would be looking at both data centers, not just one.
Mhm.
So we'll
Are
hopefully
they broken ground on both or just the one?
they're both the second one has been broken ground, and they're working on it. The first one is rapidly moving forward, and expect to see operation very soon, if not already. And so
We're seeing operations already. They're beginning their startup operations.
And so one of the things that they were able to secure there was a certificate of occupancy, which
Yep.
is one of the triggers for the SIP. So that first data center is right around the corner. The second data center, another year out from that possibly, but we'll see how that goes.
Are you comfortable giving a ballpark for the community fee and the property taxes?
So the community service fee, that was one of the assumptions in coming up with this $3 million guesstimate. And so the assumption was that the community service fee would be maxed out. As some may recall, the community service fee is another calculation. It's 25% of their tax savings, capped at 2.5 million. So the assumption, which is one of the dangers here, was we assumed it was 2.5 million.
Plus the 3.
Plus the guaranteed annual payment. The potential 3 is from both data centers. There's 2 community service fee payments and 2 property tax payments.
What's the number on the property tax?
The property tax payment, again, I'm just going to keep repeating it, but it's another assumption.
Yeah.
Depending on the value and the structure that's provided to us or dictated to us by the state and Business Oregon, is that if it's under $1 billion, they pay taxes on 50 million.
Right.
And so using, again, the assumption that 600 million, they would pay taxes on 50 million, which is approximately $900,000 a year, broken out to all the different taxing districts, just like the community service fee.
It's pretty modest, a few $100,000, a couple $100,000 to us.
Yeah.
All right. So the main number, again, with all the caveats and the conservative.
For this conversation to get to tonight, I would encourage the council to focus on that guaranteed annual payment, and that's where this $3 million estimate is coming from.
Well, I guess my ultimate point is that guaranteed annual payment is not the sum total of what the city or other entities would be getting from Google.
Correct.
We're not talking about putting all of our SIP money. We're talking about a very large chunk of
Correct.
it. All right,
Correct.
Thank you.
It'll be the 2 data centers, each over 15 years, starting at different times. And I'll just, for the record and whatnot, also mention the initial payment, which is that one-time fee. So to your point, there are several other funding mechanisms to the SIP agreement.
Thank you so much.
So go ahead, Rod.
Just to clarify, because we keep saying SIP, 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 but do we still have funds coming in from the enterprise zone and so forth? And, is that money being considered in all of these totals and whatnot?
We certainly do have the annual payments coming in from the second enterprise zone agreement, as well as slightly more notably the Taylor Lakes agreement. Those funds are currently allocated in our special enterprise reserve fund. We've been using a lot of those funds for different special projects, helping with some of our sidewalk and ramp programs, right out of the gate, a lot of those Taylor Lake funds were allocated to the community college's skill center, which has been completed. But that is a revenue source to be looking at for.
I just think it's very important as we go forward with public relations and whatnot, that we do identify that as well, and the things that those funds are doing in the community. Okay.
Correct.
We're not using our last dime in this manner. Okay.
And I think in part of the direction I've heard from council and staff has been working on is that communication plan and how we're going to message that to the community. One of the hopes of the output from tonight is we'll have some additional guidance and consensus from council that will allow us to finish some of those pieces and actually start getting them out there very soon. We'll do a final review hopefully next week and start pushing those sooner rather than later. I think it's also important before the end of the year that council provides some staff direction on the different SIP elements, not only the guaranteed annual payment for tonight's conversation, but that community service fee, the initial payment, and property tax. And so that's why we'll be having that work session in November. And communicating all these different pieces is critically important. And knowing that we are prioritizing some of those key and core services that cities provide, and providing or minimizing the increases we might be looking at to benefit our ratepayers and our constituents is an important part of that priority. There's a lot of needs out there, but this is one of those core services the city provides and our citizens are directly impacted by.
Thank you.
So
Very helpful. Thank
so
you.
it sounds like you came up with $3 million as being a reasonable and appropriate amount of SIP funds to put into the pot, and set at 3 million, you backed into the rate increases that are necessary to go with that 3 million, as opposed to 5% is a reasonable rate increase. And if we assume 5%, we're going to need this much in SIP. So you set the SIP first and backed in. Yeah. Okay.
And just as a little bit of a refresher or reminder, we talked at our last presentation about different levels of SIP. It was our understanding the council was most interested in the 3 million level with some, the assurances of the same caveats that yes, that we think that was it was reasonable to expect to receive that much. And then we just wanted to compare that to what if we did no SIP. So we didn't do any more work on 1 million and 2 million. You can envision that those would fall between the two scenarios that we've just provided you with no SIP and 3 million. All the numbers that we, I guess, will be presenting from here on are 3 million or no SIP. So.
Okay, next slide then. So if you apply the revenue slope or those rate increases under the different scenarios to the current rates, just across the board to illustrate what the rate impacts would be, that's what this table shows for different time increments. And so based on, again, this kind of medium case capital funding strategy, the current rate structure, and as you can see, the higher industrial growth is estimated to reduce the bill in 2041 by 15 to 20%. So you can see with the SIP funding, that bill is projected to be $125 under high industrial growth. This is monthly bill, 151 with low industrial. In the case of zero SIP, those bills increase significantly by $20 to $25 a month. And so that would increase the bill 17 to 20% in 2026. So significant bill impacts associated with those higher rate increases. We'll get the next section, or after we talked about systems development charges, we'll talk about how this is, again, under the current rate structure, and there's lots of potential changes to the rate structure we have yet to talk about. Okay.
So if I may make just a quick comment to kind of emphasize that point. I mean, I think a few slides ago, I forget if it was one or both of you mentioned that these needs that we have and these projects that we're looking at are needed regardless of Google being here. These are projects that they're aging out, and we would need to be doing these things anyways. And that what we're looking on this slide here is that taking Google revenue or SIP revenue, we're able to keep the rates potentially 17 to 20% lower than they would have otherwise happened. And that's that direct impact to the ratepayers in this community.
The industrial customer benefit is actually much more dramatic than that. In addition to the $3 million SIP that we're talking about for the one industrial customer, their water use and the sales to the city are a very large component of the revenue package and the rates and the revenues that are the rate increases would be, I mean, I don't know if you even have a number off the top of your head, dramatically more, maybe double what we're talking about if we didn't have large industrial customer. So, you know, we've been talking a lot about SIP and how much we can use that to mitigate what the rate increases would be. But the bigger impact is actually the amount of water that we're selling them and how that is going to help us pay for these improvements that, as Matthew mentioned, need to be undertaken whether we had a large industrial customer or not. The water treatment plant's worn out. The pipelines from the plant to town are worn out. And we would have to replace those without the benefits of SIP and without the benefit of the rate revenues that we receive from having a large industrial customer. So sorry for jumping in on Matthew's comment, but that's the SIP is just a piece of it, a piece of the benefit of having a large industrial customer.
Thank you, Dave. I just, for my own sake internally here, nailing down the Google funds again, or having a common conservative estimate of the Google funds is useful internally, but also just to kind of get a sense of what the opportunity cost is, right? If this is like all of our SIP money, that's a different conversation. If it's a good chunk of it, then that's also a different conversation.
Okay, just to summarize on this section before we move to the next segment of the financial analysis is, you know, significant rate increases regardless of the scenario. But certainly the SIP funding helps address a large part of the need. So the policy issues are around the timing and the level of the initial rate increases and how much revenue to commit of the SIP to the water program. And so, yeah, I think and I don't know about the timing in terms of the plan. It'd be nice to limit the number of scenarios that we're including in the master plan at this point. So do you want to go on to the next section and then come back and talk? Okay, let's go on to systems development charges. So we're going to change from rates for a minute and talk about SDCs because they are another potential funding source for the capital improvements. You have existing SDCs, but they have not been updated since 2007. So they're currently only bringing in about $75,000 a year on average the last 3 years. Oregon law does govern how we develop SDCs and what you can charge for and those sorts of things. So we've developed a methodology based on the capital improvement plan and that framework. So let's go to the next slide. So part of the requirements under Oregon statute is that the project list, the costs and the timing percent of eligible for SDCs is determined by the master plan, part of a system plan adopted by the council. And the methodology determines then what portion of those project costs are related to future growth. And the methodology also lays out the factors and assumptions for charging individual developments based on their anticipated impact on the system. It's important to understand that the project list and the methodology produce the maximum SDC or kind of the ceiling. Council does not have to adopt that full SDC, but it does provide another potential funding source for these capital improvements. Okay. Under Oregon law, the SDCs can include both future improvements through the improvement fee, and that's the master plan projects, for new facilities and upgrades to existing facilities. As we've talked about, a lot of those projects are addressing existing needs because they're replacing outdated infrastructure. You can also include a reimbursement component for any facilities that have available capacity in the system. And so there is some of that that's presented in our draft systems development charge findings. And that's assuming that those were funded by the city and that there's available capacity for growth. The benefit of reimbursement fee revenue is that you can use it for any type of capital improvement project related to the water system. The improvement fee revenue is specific to projects on the plan that have that growth component. The compliance component, you can also spend SDCs for costs associated with developing the SDC methodology. So my time helping you with this process, master planning to produce a project list, and some internal accounting and other administrative costs. The next slide then just shows what our estimates of the growth share of the project list costs are. And so you can see that about 46% of the total costs are estimated to be growth related when we consider the portion that's replacing existing capacity and that which is expanding capacity. And that's particularly true for pump and storage requirements. But overall, just about $100 million in today's dollars that's anticipated for growth. Okay, next slide. SDCs are intended to recover, as I mentioned, costs in proportion to the impact on the system. And for water systems, we typically estimate that by the water meter size that will serve the development. Your current SDCs are based on water meter size. However, the factors that are used to scale the meter size charges are not in alignment with how much water is being used at the different meter sizes. So they are consistent with the fact that for when you look at a residential or non-residential customers with the smallest meters, the 3/4 inch meters, they generally utilize about the same. What isn't true though is as the meter size increases, non-residential, so commercial, industrial customers tend to use more of the meter capacity. So one of the recommendations in having evaluated the current factors and alternative factors that are based on different meter technology, more modern meter technology, that those calibrate much better to the actual use of those meters and the water use from those customers. What the result of that is that the SDCs for larger meters would increase more significantly than the smaller meters. And that's to capture the fact that they're utilizing more of the system. And the next slide shows the estimated SDCs for the different meter sizes for each component of the charge. So as I mentioned, there's the reimbursement component. That's the SDCR column. The SDCI is the improvement fee associated with the master plan projects. And then the compliance costs is the final component. The combined SDC updated is about $9,300 for a 3/4 inch meter, whether it's residential or non-residential. That compares to about $2,300 for the current SDC, again, based on 2007 costs.
Well, and just to clarify, the $2,317 that we're currently charging was not the full amount that the methodology would have allowed. You know, there was a discussion and there was a decision that the city wanted to be sure that they remained competitive in their SDCs with neighboring communities. So none of the 4 SDCs that the city charges for its water, sewer, storm or transportation are at the max level. So, and the combined SDC or the new SDCs that that are outlined here are the max potential. Again, council can choose to charge something less than that based on other factors.
What level of SDC were you assuming in the previous analysis that we just discussed?
I want to say, and boy, I'll be close. I want to say we left about $600 in the water SDC on the table. That we had justified something close to $3,000 for a 3/4 inch meter, and we're charging 23.17. Did I answer your question, or were you asking something else?
I think I was asking something else.
Okay.
Maybe I wasn't clever enough to follow the answer. In the previous segment of our
The financial-
conversation, we had the financial plan.
Yeah,
Assume I'm guessing you had an SDC assumption baked into that.
yes.
What was the SDC assumption?
I assumed that it would double. I wasn't ready to go out on a limb that you would immediately raise it to the 9,300. So that would improve. The issue with SDCs, of course, is that the revenue is dependent on development. And so the rate of development becomes another variable in the equation. It's not a reason to not increase them and not to include that, because when that development does occur, that is an excellent revenue source for those improvements. But we are generally tend to be conservative because of that. So there was both the not knowing what council at this point is feeling in terms of the level of SDCs, and also the uncertainty around the pace of development. So for these initial numbers, I was somewhat conservative, but did assume some increase.
Glad, thank you.
Several slides ago on the SDC overview, you have here revenue from water SDCs averaged about $75,000 over the last 3 years. If you know offhand with the modeling that you did, what would that increase be with your assumption?
Yeah, I think I just put it up at 150,000.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. We could based on, once we get some direction from council, I think there are some developments that are on the horizon that we have a sense as to how many equivalent units that would be. We could run some numbers as to what that would mean at the higher SDCs. But for now, I just assumed let's double that 3-year average.
Yeah, and I guess I'm just trying to emphasize the magnitude of the revenue source.
It's not
with-
millions.
With the concern over as a barrier potentially if they're too high to development.
The next page has us current and updated compared to a number of other communities. Is the updated the doubled?
That is the max. I did use in this chart, I used that maximum. So you can see that the teal color is about a $10,000, it's that 90 whatever 100 SDC. So you are currently the lowest amongst these communities, and you would move slightly up the scale, but still lower than the median.
Is there a place that you want to point later?
With respect to the SDC?
Yeah.
Let's go back one, Brian, if we could. So I just want to mention here that you'll see at the very bottom of this table that the meter size generally works pretty well for typical commercial and institutional users. It doesn't work really well for industrial because of the impact that they have for large industrial, because of the potential impact they have on your system, their specific peaking requirements. And so what you do for sewer is what we're recommending you do for water, which is to have an individualized calculation for a large industrial user that would be based on a gallon per day estimate. And when they come to you with their projection of what their demand would be, that you charge them based on that demand. That is the standard practice for industrial.
And I'd like to, I guess, provide a little bit of history and context for that very briefly. There's been a pretty big disconnect in our SDC collections for large industrial customers between water and sewer. And the most recent example is using meter size for the most recent industrial developments that were occurring per facility. It would have collected about $500,000 in water SDCs just based on the size of the meter that they put in. Conversely, on the wastewater side, we collected $3 million. And if we adopt a similar approach, as Deb mentioned, from similar to what we're doing for sewer, and actually look at the volume of water they're using, and that can be adjusted, you know, if they give us a number and then they go online and they're using more, we go back and collect the difference. We think it's worth considering a similar approach for the water that we're using for sewer, and that's what's presented at the very bottom of this table here, the industrial dollars per gallon of $12.94 per million gallon per day. So that's why we present this option. It's not something that we currently have, but we suggest considering it.
Okay, let's go to the last slide then, Brian. So just to summarize, I guess, here is that, again, the methodology establishes the ceiling and the, you know, the revenue, if it's 150,000 annually, that's equivalent to about a 2.5% rate increase, just to give you some order of magnitude. And we did not, for the purposes of the initial calculations, assume going to the ceiling. We can certainly rerun the numbers on that basis if desired, but wanted to get council's feedback before we reran those numbers. We do have a separate adoption kind of requirements with the statute that's separate from the master plan, that you need to notify interested parties that you're going to consider a change in the methodology. And then there needs to be a methodology specific to the SDC development that's available 60 days prior to the public hearing. Okay, do you want to come back to that at the end to talk more about that? Dive into the rates, back into the rates?
Maybe we talk about the rates now and then you'll have some context for
Coming back to the SDC. Okay.
SDCs and
Yep.
wrap things up.
Okay. All right, just to recap, the current rate structure, 2 customer classes, residential and commercial. Both of the customer class rates include a fixed charge, we call the base charge, and a minimum quantity that's included in that. For residential, it's 10,000 gallons. For commercial, it's 5,000 gallons. And then there's a volume charge that applies to usage above the minimum. And you can see how that is priced for the 2 different customer classes. Okay, next slide. So this discussion occurs in 2 parts. First, we'll talk about the cost of service analysis, which evaluates how each customer class could be charged in terms of aligning with the services provided and cost of service principles. And then we'll talk about the rate structure. So that's how costs are recovered within a given customer class. And for purposes of the cost of service, we evaluate based on a test year, and so initially we look at fiscal year 2025, which is the current year, just to see, you know, what are the costs today, how they align with different functions, services provided by the utility, and how would cost recovery change for the different customer classes. But then we are also considering how the cost structure is expected to change as you implement this capital improvement program. So it provides consideration for future rate increases and how that revenue slope, that across the board, is applied to the different customer classes. So the cost of service gives benchmark information relative to charging the different customer classes, but also how much comes from base and how much potentially comes from the volume charges. Generally, cost of service analysis is updated every 3 to 5 years or so to make sure that costs stay in alignment with the services being provided and the utilities cost structure. That's in the case where you have a fairly steady program, both in terms of customer mix, customer demands, and costs. You have neither. You have both massive changes to your cost structure driven by the capital improvement plan, as well as significant changes in your industrial customer projected demands. So thus my earlier point about it would be good to kind of, get some of that initially go to adjust rates for a year or two, not lock yourself into a long term until some of this additional information is available with respect to the capital financing strategy. But even then, I think you're looking at kind of a transition, most likely to these costs of service base rates as you're implementing that capital improvement program. Okay, next slide. So just to look at the, when I talk about the cost structure, what am I talking about there? There's two components of it. We look at operation and maintenance costs and capital costs separately. For the operation and maintenance costs, we consider how staff spend their time, what, different materials and services, chemicals relate to treatment, things like that. We look at then the capital costs, both what facilities are today and the improvements and how they relate to different types of demands. So there's some of the costs are incurred because of fire protection capacity that's needed in the distribution system, or storage capacity that's related to emergency and fire. Maximum day demands are a big driver of costs. So that's a consideration as well. So we take the costs and we put them into these categories so that then we can allocate them to customers in proportion to their demand relative to these same categories. And in your case, as I mentioned, if you look at the percent of capital costs over the planning period, that's going to increase significantly. So even just in 2025 to 2031, which is a relatively short 5 or 6 year period, you go from your total revenue requirement being about 10% capital to over a third. And that's going to grow even more in the future. So it's important because it does have implications for how much of the future revenue slope is related to residential versus non-residential customers. Okay. So it's a very, there's a lot of science and math behind that aspect of the analysis. And that produces then these cost recovery percentages. Now, I want to point out here that for the purposes of this analysis and the updated results that we're bringing you tonight, we have combined all non-residential customers into a single class. When we talked to you last time, we were breaking out industrial from commercial, which was all other non-residential. The reason for that is a couple. Non-residential, both industrial commercial customers have similar fire protection needs. So there are some of the services that are similar. Administrative considerations, just we have had a hard time drawing the line on what's industrial versus commercial. And combining them has benefits for non-industrial customers generally. So they are, when you combine the customer classes and the fact that they tend to have higher peaking requirements, especially your governmental and institutional customers because of irrigation. Combining those with industrial tends to flatten those peak requirements, and it averages out so that basically all those customers share in those costs. It doesn't impact residential, the proportion that's paid by residential versus commercial or non-residential. It only impacts cost recovery within the non-residential class. So this chart here, you see it both looking at one point of this is an earlier point I think that Dave made of even without any change in the rate structure or the cost of service, the fact that your industrial demands are growing, that will shift so that your non-residential customers are picking up more of the cost burden. So you can see under the status quo or the SQ scenario here, the first column is the current, and about 51% of the, it's split pretty evenly between non-residential and residential. 51% non-residential, 49% residential. And then we go to, if you look at the third column, that's the status quo, no changes to the rate structure or the cost of service, and it just reflective of the projected demand, the projected growth in industrial, that they would go, non-residential would go from 51% of the total to 57%. So even without any changes, the industrial customers are going to pay more because they're using more water. What the cost of service gets at is just beyond that growth in demand, should they be paying more just, because of their characteristics of use that go beyond average demand? And the answer is yes. So you can see that in fiscal year 2025, it goes from 51% to 54%. There's about 3 percentage point increase in what would be allocated to non-residential customers and a corresponding decrease in residential. And that by 2031, that estimate is 61% from non-residential and 39% from residential. Now, remember, the cost pie is getting bigger. So that doesn't mean that residential customers are necessarily going to see a rate decrease, although they may initially in some cases, but they would be contributing less towards those improvements based on the cost of service results.
So the rate increases would go up slower than they
Yes.
would have normally.
Yes. Did you want to add something?
Yeah, the only other point I was going to make was in this analysis where we've combined commercial and industrial, that's the same way we're already doing it. So we already have those two customer classes combined. They already share the same rate, which is different than the residential rate. And I think one of the take homes for me was it was mentioned that this cost of service analysis is typically done by many utilities every 3 to 5 years. Well, we last did it in 2006 with our last master plan update. But we've only, shifted or drifted, I guess, about 3% off of having that desirable equity. That's, to me, the way I interpret the first two bars up there is our existing rate structure, 51% of the revenue from the non-residential. If we readjust the cost allocation based on cost, they pick up 54%. So we're catching this at the right time, in my view. And we have the opportunity then to provide the equity, make the adjustments, and apply or adopt a rate schedule that is equitable moving forward. And because of the changes in consumption and use that we're going to see in the coming years, this cost of service analysis probably should be done more frequently than every 20 years. So, but like I say, the combination of an industrial and commercial classes into a single non-residential user class is what we're already doing, and we would propose to continue to do that.
Is that typical of other communities?
Yeah, and I'll show you some of the comparative information that some don't even differentiate residential and commercial.
So I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh,
Yeah.
yeah. So there's there's a wide range of practices from more classes to 0 classes. This is kind of in between, and so definitely consistent with, industry
So when we
practices.
adjust the rates, the industrial, commercial share would go from 51% of the total to 54%. And then increases after that are due to more water usage and not,
More water usage, but also just more per unit being allocated to non-residential because of things like greater fire protection, emergency storage needs, meter-related capacity issues. So all of the different types of service requirements, peaking demands, those. So if you go to the next slide, Brian, and I want to orient you to the last 3 columns because I think that's where it shows you probably most clearly. There's a lot of numbers on this table that produce those numbers, but here we're just working with that 7.3% overall revenue increase. And this is where we get into how much of that should be paid by residential versus non-residential. So the updated cost of service column shows you that if you were to go to from where you are today to the updated cost of service and average that out over the 2025 to 2031 period, without any change in cost of service, it would just be 7.3% across the board to all the rates and all the customers. Under cost of service, residential would go up 5.5% roughly, whereas non-residential would go up 8.5 to 9.5, depending on the rate component, the volume rates versus the meter charges, the base charges. So that's how the cost of service informs how that revenue increase is shared by the different customer classes. And then the last column shows you, and this gets at the continued change in the cost structure. When we first started talking about this within the team, it was, we were wondering, well, could we just shift to the cost of service in the next year and then basically apply the rest of the rate increase across the board? And what that's showing you is the answer to that is no, because that continued evolution of the cost structure changing and the fact that most of the increase would be experienced in that first year. But what that column shows is say you made the change in fiscal year 2025 and got everything realigned to cost of service, residential would still go up slightly less than the 7.3%. So in this case, 6.8 to 7%, whereas non-residential would continue to increase at a faster rate. So it's just, I think that's most clearly where you see the results of the cost of service.
And again, these percentages are under the low industrial growth scenario. That's the 7.3% revenue increase that we saw earlier.
Exactly. And so these rate increases, the relative difference, so if we were looking at the 5.3 scenario under the high industrial growth, residential would still be less than that and non-residential would still be greater than that. It would just be, relatively the same to that, recalibrated to that lower rate increase.
so this 7.3 matches the scenario on page 11. Which is,
So that's the 3 million SIP, the low industrial. Yes.
you didn't do a table for the high industrial.
No, it would just, it's just, again, it would be similar proportions up and down between the two classes. Yeah. Okay, let's go on to the next one.
Just ask one question. When you guys say low industrial growth and high industrial growth, are you talking about new industries coming into the area? Because that ain't happening.
Rate
Okay.
at which the new data centers come online.
Yeah.
Ramp up their use.
Okay, but nothing else, because there's really no land for anybody else to come in anyway. All right, I just wanted to be clear. Okay, thank you.
There's another consideration with respect that the cost of service and rate design looks at in relation to setting the fees and charges. So we've talked about the impacts on the customer classes. We also have to consider how much is coming from the base charge versus the volume rate, because you don't want to get in a situation where we're shifting so much of the revenue recovery to the volume charge that the revenue stream is less stable as you are entering into a period where you're going to have a large debt service payment. Certainly, SIP revenue would be a nice, steady, stable stream, but you still need to have your revenue from rates be balanced in terms of providing for a certain fixed amount. The industry standard is basically, these days, is 40% or more from fixed, because 80% or more of the costs are fixed. The staffing, the debt, all of that is fixed in any given time. So as customers use less water, there's not an immediate impact to the system in terms of a reduction in cost. So we calibrate the fixed and the volume charges to maintain at least 40% revenue recovery. Currently, you can see under the status quo that it's about 52% from fixed and 48% from volume. Both of the rate design alternatives reduce the minimum quantity that is included in the base charge. Therefore, there is some reduction in the base and the fixed revenue, but we've designed these scenarios to not go below the 41% or the 40%. So just, again, something to consider. And we can, once we have a sense from council on the base assumptions, we can put together a package that includes all these different variables. Okay.
Remind me what the status quo allows for usage. There's no volume charge, correct? It's just.
Oh, there is a volume charge. It's 10,000 gallons in the residential base and 5,000 gallons in the non-residential. So for the rate, go ahead.
But we have a lot of our customers do not pay a volume rate at all.
That's absolutely true. If you skip ahead a couple slides.
Oh,
Yeah, this one.
okay.
This shows you the distribution of consumption, and those numbers on the bottom are pretty tiny, but the green box says 70% of accounts use less than the 10,000 gallons per month on average. 52% of accounts use less than 7,500 gallons. And what's not on here, but I have, because we added the 5,000 gallon scenario, the 5,000 in the base, 40% of customers use less than 5,000 gallons on average. So yes, a lot. So the point of, there is a volume charge, but there's a lot of customers that don't pay the volume charge because they're not using more than 10,000 gallons. So, all right, let's go back one, Brian, just a reminder of the rate design policy questions that we identified at the last meeting is, so a couple of questions about, one, eliminating or reducing the minimum quantity in the base charge. Council asked us to consider, in addition to the 7.5, going from 10 to 7.5 for residential, to also look at going to 5. So we're bringing back that option. And we're showing for non-residential both the 0, so eliminating that minimum quantity, and also one option that stays at the 5 in the minimum quantity. So modifying the rates by class to more closely align with the updated cost of service results. These rates that I'm presenting tonight all assume the change in the cost of service. So that's baked into these numbers now. Whereas before we were not including that. And So we're giving you and this is all so that we didn't bring you 100 pages of presentation. All of this is based on the 3 million SIP low industrial scenario. So that's 7.3%. I've got models for every scenario. And again, once we get direction from council on the base parameters, then we can turn around kind of the final rate package. But just for purposes of presentation, that 3 million SIP low industrial is what we're using. Okay, let's go on to the next. So we've talked about this, that there's a lot of accounts that use less than the minimum. So, but the other, just a reminder of partly why we're looking at these options to reduce the minimum is the city has run into issues with getting funding. And you tell the story better than I.
So as we mentioned at previous presentations, it's unusual for a community to include as much water as we do, the 10,000 gallons for residential accounts in their base rate. And I ran into challenges when we were getting the funding for the Dog River pipeline. We were using what are SRF, state revolving loan funds for that project. And they normally assume 7,500 gallons per month for residential customers. Part of the analysis and what kind of terms, loan terms that we could get, where if our rates were at a certain level, we qualified as a disadvantaged community or economically disadvantaged community, I think they call it, and could get the better term of 1% interest for 30 years. Or if we didn't meet that standard, it would have been, I believe it was 2.6% interest for 20 years. So we were trying really hard to get to 30% for one. Their tendency, since we have 10,000 gallons, was, well, they wanted to prorate our water rate down to adjust it to if a person only used 7,500. And it was a 2-month conversation with the funding agency to convince them that no, it's not appropriate to prorate that, because even if our customer only uses 7,500, they still pay for 10,000 gallons. Their bill is $55 regardless of how much water they use up to 10,000 gallons. It was an uphill battle. We were successful in making that argument. But it seems prudent, since it's so unusual for any community to include this much water in their residential rates. It seems prudent to be more consistent with what other utilities are doing and to lower our base rate volume down to 7,500 or less, so that that conversation doesn't have to happen when future funding discussions. We recently got some information, and I think this, I don't think we can completely rely on this yet, but one of the sources of revenue that we might be able to use, we talked about revenue bond to meet the 20% match for the WIFIA loans. It's a possibility. It looks like Sandy used SRF funds for that match. And we were talking about the rates for revenue bonds being higher than the WIFIA rates, higher than 4%. Wouldn't it be great if we could make that argument that we were still a disadvantaged community and be able to have a conversation about 30% or 30 years for 1%, that the amount of water in this base rate for residential customers can be really important to that discussion. And that's why, we've been pretty consistently recommending we think about 7,500 or less, and we've provided different scenarios for you to consider along those lines.
Are we sure that WIFIA doesn't have any kind of requirement?
For the rates?
Well, the same requirement that the state revolving loan fund has.
I believe they've only got a single interest rate for the loans, regardless of what your rate structure is. They don't have the determination of disadvantaged community or not.
Councilor McLaughlin.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but I remember this conversation, years ago when we were looking at that adjustment for volume usage, and that was the topic. And it was to promote at that time, greener lawns in the summer. So that's why at that time we said it, but it would be to our advantage to reduce it down to 7,500 or possibly lower. Would that increase the amount of money that would come in? over that top, because if a person got that amount, where they would have to pay for the excess lower amount, would that be a revenue producer?
It wouldn't, well, yes, we have run the rates that develop a structure where they pay less for the base rate and, more of their water bill is consumption because they're going to trip the consumptive rate sooner, right? So
Right.
we've got those scenarios to present for you. And you're exactly right. We had those conversations 15 years ago or so, 10 years ago or so. And at that time, the base rate for residential included 15,000 gallons. So we dropped it from 15 to 10.
And I remember.
With still, wanting to kind of find some balance between, having a green community and people not disincentivizing, or we didn't want to disincentivize people watering their lawns, but also some equity. We had not yet run into this issue with the loaning, the funding agencies using this $7,500 number. So that's kind of a new thing for us to consider and I think a very significant one for us.
But it would be advantageous in justifying if we look and say because of potential loans and payback on loans and making it standardized, that it would make sense for us to realign, particularly at this time when we're taking a look at all the rates. Maybe we adjust and add that, and when you build the new rate components coming back, we take that into consideration.
And so we've got that for you tonight, and we'll get to that in just a second. And I guess the other piece of that argument that I would suggest is it's just unusual. That's not the current practice for utilities to include that much water in their base rate. We're a real outlier on that.
I think our neighbors are going to appreciate the argument that lowering the base rate is likely to save us all a lot of, some amount of money, significant money over the long run. And also it affects the thirstier half, the half that use more than 7,500.
Yeah. And I think I shared at the previous presentation too. We have had the request from customers over the years. They feel like they're paying for water they're not using. So I think that is a valid part of the conversation as well.
And I have heard that again and again, especially the senior population, that's a concern. And so I think it's appropriate time that we consider this option. All right.
Okay, so this table shows the reduction. So this is residential, reduction in the base quantity from 10 to 7.5. So you can see that in the upper left-hand quadrant, which shows you the rate structure. So the base quantity current is 10, goes to 7.5. In the revised COS is cost of service. We're showing it, that first set of columns is revenue neutral. So you're just recovering the same amount of revenue overall from all the customers. Residential is realigned to the new cost of service, which is less for them as a class than current. FY 25-26 assumes the first increment of an overall revenue increase, but again, they would increase at at a slower pace. Okay, so this does include now the cost of service impacts, which has the opportunity to offset some of the impact of the rate structure change, meaning that large volume users who otherwise would see a more significant rate increase by reducing the volume in the base and charging more for the volume and the higher volume rate, it's an opportunity, it just again points back to, this is a great opportunity to realign the rate structure at a time when the cost of service changes would help soften the impacts on some of the customer base. And it would provide initially some bill decreases for the smallest volume users. Ultimately, those are going to increase as the rate increases in future years, but for a year or two, first couple of rate increases, their bills don't increase, or They might even decrease slightly. And then, provide some rate relief for small users. So I'm
Steven.
showing three different bill quantities here. So the first one is your typical user that uses about 8,000 gallons. And then a 5,000 gallon user in the middle, and then a larger quantity of 20,000 gallons. And so you can see that for the typical bill, that's 55.30 today, because they're not using more than the base, they're just paying the base. We go to the 7.5, there's some additional quantity there, 91 cents that would be added because, there's a little bit that would be billed, but the base charge is decreased because we're reducing the amount that's in that quantity that's in the base charge. And then when we look at, well, you're probably not going to do the realignment of the cost of service without including some revenue increase. If you were to, package it all together, then what you'd be looking at is that FY 2025, 26 set of numbers. So you're still going to see a slight decrease in the base, going from 55 to 52.82. A little bit more on the quantity charge, but still overall a slight decrease. And this is really reflecting that, realignment to the cost of service. The large quantity bill would increase some because you've got a lot, more, the volume rate goes from $1.68 to $1.87. A larger component of that customer's bill is that volume charge. And you're also charging for 2.5 additional units. And the small user would see a little bit of a decrease because they're still using less than what would be in the base.
But this assumption does not take into account the additional costs associated with all the improvements.
Right. This is just assuming 1 year of rate increases in that 25, 26 column. So then they would go up, what was it? The residential average increase was about 6.8 to 7%. So then they would increase at about those rates.
Because of the improvements.
Because of the improvements. Yeah. This would buy the first year of rate increase. And still you've got some decreases. So if we go to the 5 quantity allowance, the reduction, so this would cut in half the quantity allowance. So you can see that the base rate is slightly lower in this option. The volume rate is higher. Now you're looking at the typical user. The typical bill would increase slightly, but not at the 7.5%. It would increase significantly less than that because of the cost of service. And but now your larger bill, your larger quantity user, somebody in the summer using 20 units of water would see a bill increase of 10.8% under this scenario. Your small user still even benefits more because the base charge has decreased because now we're only including 5 units of water.
Sorry, refresh my understanding. Under both scenarios, the absolute dollar amount collected remains the same, plus or minus, but exactly how it's collected changes a little bit.
The 2025-26 column, so the far right of the 3 columns for each user group there, thank you. That includes the first revenue increase, roughly 7.3% for the system, but a much smaller amount for residential to realign to cost of service. So they all, yeah. So compared to current and 25-26, there is a revenue increase baked into that. When you look at current versus revised cost of service for 24-25, there is no revenue increase as part of that.
I'm curious, Dave and Matthew, if you have a preference between a base 5 and a base 7.5.
First.
Yep.
You've got to run the thing, you've got to collect the money. What do you want?
Audit thing was right there.
My biggest priority was the one I outlined a little bit ago is making it easier to get good financing for the city. And I I like to going to 7.5. Let's wean the community off slowly. Maybe future adjustments are warranted. But I think that moving from 10 to 7.5 starts to, address the issue of people being concerned about paying for water they're not using. 7.5 is a lot closer to the 4,000 or 5,000 gallons a month that we typically see. We capture 70% of the water customers within that 7.5. It results in some reductions in monthly bills for quite a few residential customers. And if we're going to reevaluate this every 3 to 5 or 6 years, future adjustments can be made if there's a desire to go from 7.5 to 5. That was kind of my thinking on this.
So if we did assume a 7.5, that scenario is not on here, but it would be, if you look at the first of the three, it would be a little.
It was the page
less.
before. Go to page 37. Those numbers are the 7.5, or yeah, the 7,500 gallon scenario.
Oh,
Mr. City Manager, do you have a preference?
No, I mean, I concur with Dave, and I'm hard pressed to find a compelling reason to jump to 5. And that's just arguing the same point in a different way. There's good reasons for 7.5. There's strong logic behind it with everything that Mr. Anderson said. I'm hard pressed to extend that further to jump to 5.
Thanks.
And I guess the only thing I would offer is even at 7.5, we would be, it's very unusual for communities to include that much water in their base rate. So we would still be doing something that's somewhat unusual.
Yeah, your neighboring community, Hood River, I think is at 5. And there's in our rate comparison that we'll get to in a minute, I think there's only one other community, and that was West Lynn, I think that included maybe 3,000 gallons or something. So it is becoming a thing of the past, and but you don't have to get there all at once. It can be phased. Yeah.
I think the only other thing I might add to it and thinking about it a little bit further is that there's, through this whole conversation, we're looking at a lot of different decision points and tweaks and changes based on assumptions on what a revenue sources may look like in the future too. And when you're talking about any kind of change management, it takes time to bring people along. And so we may want to minimize how much each change point is, looking at the whole package.
We've had to assume, or we have assumed a little bit of conservation in this as people start to pay the consumptive rate sooner. That may incentivize some people to use a little less water, and that, of course, could affect revenue. So we've assumed in these analyses 5%, I think.
0.5% per year.
0.5% per year. So we've assumed some conservation in these rates from making these adjustments to, including charging more for water, just as rates go up, and then how much is included in the base rates.
back in my former life, I was always on, I'm going back 20, 30 years ago. I thought I was told that people, normal families, normal people use 100 gallons a day per person per day. Is that still valid?
Still a pretty reasonable assumption. It varies. In Portland, it might be as low as 60. In rural communities, it could be up around 160.
Yeah. And on the far left, the K gallon, that's 1,000, 1K,
Yes.
one unit is 1,000 gallons.
Yes, exactly.
So you're assuming somebody's using 8,000 gallons. If you're assuming 7,500, that comes to, according to my arithmetic, 425 gallons per day. So a family of four, that's real close, right? Okay.
All right, let's move on then, Brian, to one more. There you go. So this just shows the distribution of accounts that would at different increases and decreases for the two options. Obviously, if you reduced it to 5,000 gallons in the base, you would have a larger number of accounts that were having increases, and that top of that increase would be greater than in the, when you're doing the smaller increment change, which is the 7.5 gallons. So, yeah. But in both cases, you're still going to have increases and decreases. Okay. Next, we look at the non-residential. So here is maintaining the 5,000 gallons quantity in the base. This gets much more complicated because to look at sample bills for non-residential, because you're changing the meter size, you have vastly different consumption levels even within a meter size. So I just picked 3 representative bills: a 3/4 inch meter, a 2-inch meter, and a 4-inch meter. And then picked kind of an average use within those meter sizes. So the 3/4 inch meter is based on 8 units of water, 61 for the 2-inch, and a lot for the 4-inch. So this shows you again that there's some change in the, just based on the cost of service and everything, there's very little change in the base rate and the volume rate, but there is some overall increase to non-residential, remember. So, but more of that comes in the form of the volume rate, and that's particularly true when we layer in the first rate increase. So that would go from 44.56 to 47.16 for the 3/4 inch meter. And you can see then for the other meter sizes, which pay significantly more. One thing to note is that as with the SDCs, the rates for have been recalibrated for the meter sizes such that the larger meters are paying relatively more, because again, those were out of alignment with modern meter factors. So that's been updated. And so here you can see that the small bill, the smallest meter size, fairly small use for a non-residential, would increase about 6.8% with that first revenue increase. But the medium and the large would increase more as a result of that relatively higher both meter and volume rates. And this is reflecting the fact that non-residential under the cost of service analysis has an increase in the overall revenue recovery from non-residential. Because here we're not changing the base quantity at all. We're really just changing cost of service and adding the revenue increase. Okay, next slide then just shows with a 0. So here the main takeaway is that now your small bill, which is 8 units, would now be increasing along with the medium and the large. And that's because for this user, now they're being charged for 5 additional units that they weren't paying for before. Before they were just paying for 3. Now as part of the volume, now they're paying for a total of 8. And so 5 additional. So there is some decrease in the base rate that's built into this, but remember, we also need to be careful that we're not decreasing the base rates such that we're dropping below that 40% revenue recovery from fixed. And so that small user would see a percentage increase that's less than the other ones, but it would be certainly more significant than if you were going to maintaining the 5 in the base. As unusual as it is for your residential customers to have the level of volume included in the base, it is very unusual for any volume to be included in the base for non-residential. So all of the comparison communities we looked at, none of them had any, generally your non-residential are going to pay for every, the base includes zero quantity and you pay for what you use. So if that's any consideration. And, comparing those two, again, the top, the larger volume rate customers, there's some additional increase, but not, in the 5, sort of the status quo of 5 in the base. It was 13.7% increase for the medium, the 2-inch customer compared to 13.2 here. And it 15.6 for the large compared to 12.8. So those are not impacted significantly by the elimination of the 5 because it's a small component of their overall use. So it's really just the small customer that would have that large of a percent increase initially. And then remember, then we go to the more, everybody increases at, for the residential or for the non-residential, I think it was 7 to 8%. So it would be much more consistent across customers. It's just the first year where you're changing cost of service and changing the rate structure where you would see these double-digit increases. Okay, next slide. This is the comparison for, yes.
So I also have a response as Councilor Richardson wanted to ask the same question on the commercial. And you might be very surprised and Deb might actually beat me about the head and shoulders.
What's your preference, Dave?
I really like keeping the 5,000. It's extremely unusual to do it. It puts us out of line with anybody else. But the ones, in my view, if I'm analyzing this correctly, that would benefit the most are our smallest businesses who have no irrigation use and are probably going to be in this 2,000 to 3,000 gallon a month range of use. The amount of water they would use would be within their base rate. And if you look at the page with the 5,000, their monthly bill, well, let's see, did I do this correctly? Their monthly bill actually stays lower because let's see, did I do that right? Yeah, they would stay at about $59 or actually even less than that. They might be down to $47 because they might not incur
If you're
if they're under 8, in fact, under 5.
Yeah.
If they're under 5, they could have a bill as low as $47, even with the realignment.
Look at what happens to it under the 0. That's
Yeah.
what it would be for the smallest user. It would be
Oh, okay.
significantly less.
Maybe I got those backwards then.
Yeah, so somebody, and I didn't show a user that was at 5. Yeah, so if you're just comparing base to base, so if you're at 5, you're going to pay under the 5 base, you're going to pay the 47.16, whereas you're going to pay 29.32 under the 0 in the base.
Yeah, so I guess I got my thinking a little bit sideways. I don't have a strong preference on this one. I think that I remember Councilor Randall's comment, I think at the previous presentation, was there might be some value to help the businesses that do have a little bit of landscaping to keep the 5. So other than that, that's all I've got to say on that.
Let's go ahead and look at the comparisons. Just a few more slides here and then I can open it up for further discussion. So this was the information that was added to the presentation. Yeah, it took a little while to compile all this information. This shows you the residential bill comparison for a 10,000 gallon per month user and you can see more easily probably in what's at your desk that what happens to the bill under the, shows you the bill for the current rate structure and then going to the 7.5 and then going to the 5. So for this 10,000 gallon user, their bill goes up in the scale, in the rank, because we're, pushing more to the volume charge, and they're a larger volume user than the average. And so it would move up relative to the current and would, change positions. Now, one thing to point out in this includes the roughly 7% rate increase under the 3 million SIP low industrial user scenario compared to other communities at their current rates. So it's not exactly apples to apples, but I wanted to give you some sense of current bill, revised bill with cost of service, 1 year of rate increase, everything in. How would that, if for some reason these communities, most of which do have annual rate increases, but if they weren't, how would you look? And you're still on the lower half, you would advance a couple of positions as a result of those increases.
So under the 10,000 gallons a month scenario, 84% of our revenue, residential revenue, would come from the fixed charge and 16% would come from the variable charge.
Yes, that's exactly.
And
yes.
that includes rate increases necessary to fund all those infrastructure improvements. You said this
Well,
seven.
again, it's the first year of the rate increase. So this is not comparing the bill in 2031 or 2041. This
Oh.
is the bill in 2026.
And 27 and 28 and
There
so
would be
on.
additional rate increases, but all of these other rates would also increase.
Right.
So we just don't know at what rate. So this is just to show you, as a result of the rate, all of those things in the bill, what does that do to you? It doesn't move you very far. What I find interesting is that the 10,000 gallon user goes up in rank because we're reducing the base. The opposite happens on the 5,000 gallon user, which is on the next page, where we're reducing the base. So here, your current rate is higher than the average, and then you would decrease the bill for that user as a result of reducing the base. So I think that shows pretty clearly that the rate structure changes that we're looking at benefit the smaller users.
So on the first sheet, under the 84%, 16% assumption,
Yep.
and the 7.3% initial increase in the water bill, we would rank 11th out of 25th communities in the size of the average water bill. And on the 5,000 gallons a month, which is the next, okay,
Mhm.
that shows 100% on the fixed charge,
Right, because
0% on the variable charge.
Right.
And we rank there 13th out of 25 communities.
and that's because you still have a base charge that's, includes 5,000 gallons, which most communities don't, other than Hood River and West Lynn. So, but this would help your small user to reposition them to be more in line with your larger users, because your larger users right now are paying a lot less relative to other customers than your small users or to other communities. So this would help with that alignment significantly.
And we've been subsidizing, just as a point of context and a reminder to ourselves, we've been subsidizing everybody's rate because we've been kind of eating into the reserves and not keeping up with costs.
That is true. All right, let's look at the non-residential rate comparison. This one, first I'm just gonna give you my observations and then you've got some more detail there. This one gets really complicated to try to graph because, again, different meter sizes, different volumes. So just the takeaways of the comparison that we did is that so you have the detailed rates at your in your other packet, your supplemental packet. Your current base meter charges for small meters are consistent, are relatively consistent with other communities. But they're significantly lower for the large meters. And this is what I said about where we've recalibrated those meter rates to have the large meter sizes go up more to be based on current standards. Both rate structure options factor that in. No other agencies include a quantity in the base charge. It gets a little confusing in the comparisons because we're dealing with different units. A lot of other communities charge based on 100 cubic feet. You charge based on 1,000 gallons. So, you'll see both in the tables that you have. The practice for classifying customers varies greatly. Tualatin Valley Water District and Beaverton, two of the customers cities that are there, they charge the same rate structure for everybody, basically. So there aren't differential rates. But then you have like a Hillsborough that's got about 10 different classes. So it really varies. And you'll see that there are some cases where industrial rates are separate from commercial rates. In some cases, the unit prices are not very different. So it's sort of like, well, what's the point? In some cases, industrial's higher. In some cases, it's lower. And that is reflective of the type of industry. So if you've got food processing or breweries, things like that, that tend to have higher peaks in the summer, then you probably have a higher industrial rate. If you have high tech, things like that, that use water really flat, evenly throughout the year, like Hillsborough, your industrial rate's going to be lower than your commercial rate. So it just really varies based on the customer mix. The city's rates and bills overall are currently lower than any of the other agencies that we looked at, but partly we picked, it's not a geographical representative range so much, although we did make sure to get Hood River because that's a close neighbor. But we also wanted to get cities or agencies that have major water investments in process or have had. And the zero base option results in obviously larger bill increases for larger volume users. So the next slide tries to capture some comparative information for those different meter sizes, and looking at commercial and industrial separately because some cities or agencies do show that. And then what I did was I ranked them rather than showing a graph for every different customer. I just did a ranking. And so the one is highest, 9 is lowest. Currently, you're lowest. And your 3 options are each ranked individually. So really, you're the lowest in all of those options, except for there's, as a result of taking the base, going to a zero base, the large commercial would be slightly higher than Hood River. So you would move up in rank relative to Hood River for the large industrial, which Hood River actually doesn't even have, well, they don't have a large 8-inch meter, but the large 6-inch meter commercial, the bill would be higher under that option. But generally, the changes to the rate structure, the first increment of rate increase wouldn't move you relative to these comparable cities. I think, the more important takeaways are things like the large meter sizes, those rates are low compared to the other communities. And then the quantity allowance being unusual for non-residential customers. Okay, last slide, finally. So just try to summarize all this. The cost of service rates, as we talked about, would reduce the projected rate increase below the system average for residential. Reduction of the quantity allowance, we've given you the 7.5 and the 5, would lead to modest bill reductions for most customers initially. Bill increases would be very limited, both in terms of the number of accounts and the dollar amount of that increase. of, associated with the 7.5% or 7,500 gallons in the base. The 5,000 in the base will lead to, again, minor reductions for small users, modest increase for all others. Here you will have bill increases that approach $10 a month, but they're very limited. And as a percentage increase, those are going to tend to be on your larger customers where that's a small percentage. Non-residential picks up more of the cost burden under the cost of service rates. So those would be above the system average and similar effects of taking away the quantity allowance, but that would provide, as we discussed, the potential to have smaller rates for the small volume users.
That's it?
That's it.
I got, I just want to clarify a few things. On page 38, no, not 38, page 41. 40 or 40, it doesn't matter. Do you know, Dave, of how many customers we have, residential versus non-residential? About, you don't have to give me an exact number.
Really rough numbers, I think
Yeah.
it's about 4,000 and 1,000,
We have 1,000 non-residential customers?
800, something like that, but it's close.
So 1/5 of our customers are picking up. 1/5 of our customers are paying more than half of our revenue. That's a true statement, right? Okay.
Right, that's by number of customer, but not by gallons used, right?
Right, yeah.
Yeah, all right.
Okay, the other thing, this is what I'm kind of confused about. Go back to page 40.
Ours are a little different numbered because we've got if you're looking at your original packet, it's going to
Or I'm looking at this.
chart. Okay. Yep. Is that which one, the 7 or the 5, the 10,000 or the
10,000.
5?
10, yeah, the 10.
Okay.
Well, I'm gonna
thank
look
you.
at both, but let's start with the 10. Okay, I said before, I think I misstated because you got 3 different scenarios here for the Dalles.
Yep.
Okay, so taking the preferred 7.5, right?
Yep.
That, I said before it's 84.16, it's actually 92% is coming from the fixed charge and 8% is coming from the variable charge under the preferred scenario of 7.5.
Yes,
Yes.
that's correct.
Okay, and that ranks 8th out of 24 communities as far as the size of the bill. Right.
Correct.
Okay, and on the next page, looking at the 3 scenarios again, 7.5, this is where this shows the Dow 7.5, 100% comes from the fixed charge.
Yep.
So, but that shows 0 revenue comes from the
That's because
variable rate?
this user is 5,000 gallons, so they're not using
yeah.
up to,
Got it.
yeah. Yeah, sorry, the 5 and the 7 and the numbers get confusing.
Okay,
Yeah, the top is how much they're using. And then the scenarios represent what the quantity that's in the base.
so under the preferred scenario of 7.5, we would rank 13th out of 24 communities.
Yeah, just Dave's preferred.
It's preferred, yeah, let the record show and the minutes show that it's preferred. And that Matthew did not take a stand, put that in the minutes.
But how many large meters do we have in the city? Industrial large? And I'm trying to understand,
One 8-inch.
Well, there's actually quite a few more than that. 1, 2, there are currently, I think, 4 8-inch with 2 more going in. I think everything that we find out is everything that we've got that's 6 inch and over associated with one customer.
Well, 6 inch, there's a number of 6 inch.
Okay.
Industrial.
I think we ended up developing a definition of our industrial customer that was useful to us when we broke the non-residential class from apart into industrial and commercial. It did that analysis, realized it was beneficial to the greater number of customers to lump them back together, especially when we were looking at things like parks. It was beneficial to parks to bring them back together. But I'm sorry, Councilor McLaughlin, I don't have the number off the top of my head as far as how many meters of the
I'm trying to get a grasp on, it appears that, of course, the 3/4 meter would be the residential generally.
and there's a lot of commercials that are still.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
And then the medium would be the 2-inch meter. And that would be predominantly, I had to get an understanding of what non-residential, and I looked it up, and it's where a person doesn't reside. It would be businesses. There are a lot of different factors in that, though.
But you nailed it. It's the non-residential is things that are not primary residences.
Correct.
So,
And I think there are 100 meters or so that are 2 inch there. I mean,
yeah, we've got quite a few 2 inch.
The reason I'm going down this path is because in all the discussions is we're just looking at fairness and assigning rights to recover operational and, in future capital projects, right? That's what we're trying to focus on. And then we don't want to overburden one class of ratepayers and shifting rate increases. That's another thing that we're trying to accomplish. And then we want to make it equitable. But the challenge is going to remain is communicating any increase that we do or any change that we do with the public. And so we're going to have to really work on that factor. And that's in your department then.
And, we didn't mention it in tonight's presentation, but council might recall, we have not adjusted our water rates for 10 years.
Yeah, I know.
And a lot's happened in that 10 years. And in fact, the last adjustment that we made in 2014 was a reduction by 5%. It was mentioned a couple times that inflation has caught up with us, that, and I've mentioned to this council a few times that the last 2 years we've seen this. We've seen that inflation has caught up to us and we've had less money to accumulate in our reserve funds. And the only reason I really wasn't talking to the council about a rate adjustment before right now in these last 2 years is we had this process and analysis underway and scheduled. So now we're able to talk to the council about real numbers and what the actual need is, what projects that's going to pay for. And the rest of the plan is talking about the need for those projects, which again, is not because of the type of customer that we have, it's because of our existing facilities are wearing out. So that's just we say, we've got a long time without a rate increase. We've done that to its end.
Back on page 40, where you talk about small bill, medium quantity bills and large bills. And you're assuming a large bill would be more than 2 million gallons a month. How many customers do we have that use more than 2 million gallons a month?
Well, the 4-inch, that was the average. I think the average volume we use within that group of customers. In the 4-inch, there's a dozen or more customers. 4-inch.
Really? We got that many that use more than
We've
2
only
million?
got one that's approaching the 2 million a month.
Okay.
Across a number of facilities. There's a
Google.
number of different accounts. Yeah.
But there's others that use more than that?
I am not remembering any off the top of my head. I
So
think
Google's the only one?
yeah.
Okay, that's what I thought.
Yeah. And they have several meters on several facilities and several accounts for us, but they have accounts that use over 2 million.
I felt that the conversation was considerably fuzzier, and I don't know how much of that was actual numbers and how much of that was my own itself back in August and considerably clearer now. So I appreciate it. It really feels like it's come into focus.
Deb has done a lot of work between August and now, and we're bringing you a lot more detail than you
What's-
had then.
I appreciate that. I feel like
What's
I'm,
amazing to me is that you can have an understanding of all these number and regurgitate them and not be a part of our city or our operation. That's amazing how you can do that.
Sorry.
No,
Uh,
but it's still impressive.
So do you have a list of questions, a specific direction?
Yeah, I think, well, kind of tick off the main assumptions that we need some clarity on. Honestly, I don't. Back to the T, industrial.
I'm sorry, but I can't hear what she's saying.
Oh,
Sorry, thank you. With the high, low industrial, would it be better just to take a middle for the purposes of the report? Or, what do you, I'm not sure how, it's not really a policy decision. It's It-
kind of
is. You think-
Do you want to be super?
how
wanna be
conservative.
Conservative. Is it, I think the policy direction I'd be interested in is the council interested in being conservative, assume the low industrial use. Do we want to be hopeful and take a middle of the road approach, or even more hopeful and take the high industrial use? I very much would appreciate council's direction, and it's basically a comfort level decision for the council regarding the revenues that'll be coming in to fund this capital improvement plan as well as operations.
So you're suggesting a compromise or something between 0 and, no, between the low and the high.
Well, I was just throwing out there if there was a medium, for purposes of the report of what we're going to package, there's you need to make a decision about what's going to be your first rate increase and when that's going to be. If that's going to be like in the first quarter of 2025 calendar year, which would still be fiscal year 25. And then of those rate options, rate structure options, which do you choose for residential and non-residential? What should we, for purposes of packaging the information in the report, the master plan report, what are we using, the 3 million SIP or something else? Are we using the low or medium or high industrial? And I think those are the main issues. If you want to provide the only other sort of variable that you could certainly weigh in on is the revenue recovery from the fixed. As I mentioned, my advice to the city is to maintain that over 40%. If you like to if you feel more comfortable at 50%, which is kind of where you are now, then as opposed to, a couple of those scenarios got more in the low 40%, then certainly that's something you could weigh in on, but they all are within, I think, a fairly comfortable range. The reality is, as the large industrial user ramps up volumes, that drives, more to the volume, and we have to raise the base charge more to maintain that revenue recovery. So it's going to be hard to maintain at 52%, but the good news is once they're up and running, that should be a fairly stable revenue stream.
So if we were able to come up with a consensus of several assumptions, you could come back with this is what the average residential bill would be. Okay, so I will throw out a scenario and run it up the flagpole. This isn't necessarily what I would prefer, but
may I ask one question first before we do that? Thank you. Sorry. I lost you somewhere. You lost me. When Google ramps up, you said it's going to be difficult to keep the 52%. Why is that necessary?
Oh, so one of the things that we look at in just evaluating the rate structure and
Right.
whether it's balancing all of the various objectives of revenue stability, adequacy,
Right.
equity, all those things. They're such a large user that as they ramp up consumption from their production, then that is just more added to the volume side of the ledger. And so that's going to tip the scale much more overall because they're,
Tip to
most-
scale, we're
toward
talking about,
volume rate.
you
Volume
think
revenue
that's a
recovery.
problem with
No.
equity or that?
No, I don't.
All right.
It's just that understanding like, oh, well, we don't want, if you said, well, we don't want to reduce the portion of our revenue that's coming from the base charges, that would be hard to do in your case because Google is like, has such an impact on your system and your revenue recovery.
Yeah.
So, and it's not a bad thing at all. And even from them, I would assume that that is going to be a relatively stable source, even though it's coming from the variable charge. That was my only point.
Got it. Thank you.
Mhm.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
I don't care whether it's 5 or 7.5. I'd like to see Matthew's water bill compared to mine. And, if he can live with 5, I'd go with 5, but 7.5 is fine as well. I wanted to ask Dave a couple of questions that aren't necessarily directly related to these slides, but they're the questions you get on the street because, the things are out there about things are going to happen with water and the costs and all that. And of course, there's a large group of population that blames that all on the G word. And I'm well aware of that. You mentioned earlier that these upgrades with Wicks Reservoir, Crow Creek Dam, internally within the city have nothing to do with Google. I mean, they have to be done. And I get that. In fact, I wrote about it. It was in the Columbia Connection News last night or today. So I wrote a paragraph on that very thing. The next thing I wanted to bring up, they gave us their well that was on their property. Is that correct? Or has that not happened yet?
Actually, they are drilling 2 new wells for the city on property that they're going to give us. So it's not even a transfer. And then they transferred to the city the water rights, some of the water rights that were associated with the aluminum plant originally.
So with the transfer of the wells to us, we in effect would be selling that water from that well back to them. I think that's a critical point in the public relations work as well. And then the next,
It's that every
Same
other
rates.
commercial and industrial customer pays.
so that's an important point. The other point beyond that is that, and then on top of that, they're going to be paying the SIP money and enterprise money coming to the community. So they are participating. And I think we really need to get that word out there. Has there been any estimate as to how much of Google's needs will be met by those additional wells from Google's own property?
So the capacity of the 2 new wells is more than the amount of water requested for the 2 new data centers.
So again, and I've heard that way in the past, but that's another point, Matthew, that needs to be really highlighted in this and continually highlighted in everything we put out. Is Google helping partnering on water infrastructure that will benefit their facility?
Yeah, so even more than partnering, they're fronting all the costs. And when I say fronting, I don't mean that we have to pay them back in any way. They are paying for the 2 new wells, the 2 new reservoirs, the booster pump station, and some water main improvements that were necessary to support the 2 new data centers.
So,
And that's the 20, and then that plus a new sewer pump station were the improvements that totaled $28.5 million estimated value at the time we entered into the infrastructure agreement.
right. So I just think this is important. I don't know what other time I'd have to get this out there and to the public, but I think these are important factors because we do need to build a good bullet point list of things for people to look at simply that show it's not all somebody's fault. What the thing it is a fault is that I've been here 6 years and we've talked about, the Dog River Pipeline continuously But really, since we got that completed, thanks to you, you know, it's like we're just now this last few months or whatever, hearing about all this other stuff. Why was it never worked on at some point in the past? And that's the question that's going to come out on every talk show and newspaper article out there. Okay.
So this part of the answer to that is, the last time we updated our water master plan was 2006. There were a number of projects identified in that plan, and some of them were improvements to the water treatment plant that were undertaken and completed, like the construction of a nuclear well and the replacement of the filters and some things like that. The need to have a new higher level reservoir and pump station. So that was the construction of Vista Reservoir and the pump station that supports it and the water main associated with it. A lot of those projects were done, and a master plan is trying to look at the needs over the next 20 years. Well, we got a lot of those things done. Now we're looking at what the community's needs as the community has changed for the next 20 years. And it's a list of additional projects beyond what we completed before. So I think that's a part of the answer. That's why, I'm a fan, other than the cost. I'm a fan of updating 20-year master plans every 10 years. And that's what we're going to be talking to the council about it here in another couple of meetings, is doing that for the wastewater plant 10 years into its 20-year plan. I think that goes a long ways to help some of these big projects from sneaking up on you. The last master plan did include an expansion of Crow Creek Dam, but we've been able to put that off by some of these other improvements, 2 new wells, an ASR program, some other things. So I hope that, helps understand why it is the need for these projects is being understood. The other piece of it, I think, is we really were focused on improvements to the water treatment plant that might be needed over time in the last plan. In this plan, we started off with a very thorough condition assessment. And we were surprised by the results that, hey, it's gone beyond, it's at the end of its life. It's more expensive to try to rehabilitate and then expand what we've got than it is to tear down and build new. So I think that's going to be part of our conversation as well, in terms of the messaging and what has changed. But I agree. I understand the feeling like, where did $200 million worth of projects just come out of the blue from?
Well, if we had done them before, we would have raised rates along with it then. So
Anyway, my point was to get this out
yeah, that's
verbally.
good. Yeah.
There's a list of bullet points right there. As an old radio broadcaster and news guy, all these numbers, I'm just going, I want to know how to sell it to the people that need to know, and that's our citizens. Okay. And I think we have a valid case and it needs to be done. And I appreciate all that. And I wanted that on the table while you're here, because you've got it all right there in your head. We've done lots of reservoir improvements and things like that over the years, but this is going to come as new, and a lot of blame is going to be going one way. And it's not really fair, because, as you say, they're going to help us with the water. They're helping with infrastructure. It's actually more water from those wells than they actually plan on using, at least at this point. And we haven't had an increase in rates in 10 years, and we've actually had reductions in size, or whatever it was you said earlier.
Adjustment we did was a reduction in our water rates by 5%.
Yeah. So there you go.
If
All
you
right.
don't raise rates over time, you're actually lowering your rates, right? You're not keeping.
Anyway, 5,000, 7,500, whatever you guys think, I'm with it.
Could we get a list of those projects, say major water projects that have been completed in, let's say, the last 10 years?
So I think even in your packet that you received, last
packet? Okay.
I think it was attached.
This one?
Yeah.
It is, we included it at the end, yes.
Oh. Anyway, thank you for allowing me the time. Appreciate it.
Oh, this is tonight.
Oh,
It's in your packet tonight.
yeah, that's the last page of,
Yeah.
Yeah. Right now.
okay.
Recommended.
Well, I'm not recommending, just throwing out a scenario and see what you guys all think of it.
Yep.
But Okay, changing the base from 10,000 to 7,500. Using the medium industrial usage, which I assume would be a rate increases of between 5.3 and 7.3%. Right?
Those would be
So
the revenue
Right.
increases.
that would be the revenue increases necessary. Okay, a $3 million SIP per year. Show us scenarios that include 8,000, 5,000, and 20,000 gallon users, like you did this time. And this is where I'm kind of nervous about being on the record here, but assume a rate increase initially of 10% effective as soon as possible. And I'm throwing out 10% as kind of a down payment. So what do you guys
Yeah.
think?
I'll go next and you can, anyway, I'm looking, you were at a moderate usage. I'm more prone to a conservative usage. The 3 million SIP, I'm in favor of that. I'm lowering the 10,000 to 7.5 volume and 40% fixed. You spoke about, and I'm in favor of that. And you ask about when to enact. I would say the first quarter of 25.
Sorry,
Seems
Tim, what was the
reasonable.
40% fix? What, I'm sorry, say that again.
That was just on that fixed variable to make sure that
Correct.
we're setting the base charge, even though we're reducing the quantity, that we're not dropping below the 40%.
We were
Yep.
like at 52 or something. Okay. So, and that was your recommendation and that seems reasonable. So, I think that covers where I don't know about the, rate increase though. Mayor Mays,
I just threw it out there for discussion.
yeah.
Let's throw something else out there.
Well, before we do that, I want to clarify, the only difference between what you're suggesting, and what I suggested was the industrial usage. I suggested a compromise between the low and the high, and you're suggesting we use the low.
That's correct. Conservative, yes.
With Councilor McGoughlin.
All right.
Can I ask a clarifying question? One way, potentially, unless I'm wrong, to think about this is if we direct, or if we assume a lower industrial use conservative assumption, that's going to push us to consider the higher 7.3% rate increase. Whereas if we assume the more aggressive, higher industrial use, we might be considering a 5.3% rate increase early next year. So that would be one way to look at how to tweak the potential rate increase we would consider versus picking a number, but based on the assumption of higher or lower industrial use.
And I suggested a medium
Moderate.
industrial use, which would be assuming 6.3% about, right? Because that's in between 5.3 and 7.3. Did you want to throw out another number besides 10?
I just don't like that number. Something different,
About 9.9.
something with a 0.5 in it.
10% come in.
I just threw it out there.
I thought we were talking earlier about 7.5, but I was probably confusing it with something else.
Age.
Huh?
Yeah, I
This would
think
be
we
the-
could just offer that, 10% in the first year as a revenue increase is a little bit more than we've assumed. It would allow us to have lower rate increases in the future if you took that step sooner. 10% on a smaller number, what the rates are now. So I can certainly see a justification for it. We could certainly develop that scenario. We can also, and we have developed scenarios that start out with a lower rate increase than 10% and work, but
Sorry, Mr. Mayor, you were just saying in some ways be more conservative by jumping on the rate increase early. Got it.
Yeah, and if we haven't raised our rates in 10 years, that's comes to 1% per year that we should have or could have, whatever.
That's a nice way to think about it, but that's not the way the people with their pocketbook think about it.
Come up with your own scenario. I'm just throwing it out.
Well, we're talking about rate increases
Yeah.
for a while, for the considerable future.
And I think we have to, if everybody likes the 7,500 versus 10,000, and everybody likes the 3 million SIP, and I think that the two things we have to resolve are the initial rate increase that goes into effect soon, and which of the industrial usage scenarios you like the best, high, medium, or low.
And I think there might be two things. I think it'd be worth affirming whether the council supports our updated cost of service analysis, because that really becomes the basis for what everything else looks like. Reallocating those costs so that we do now again have equity amongst our customer classes. So I think that's a decision point for us as well. And then we did talk about the amount of water to be included in the non-residential rate, whether that be 0 or remain at 5,000 gallons per month.
Right.
Well, I have a question. So assuming whatever rate increase happens, how soon?
That depends.
Well,
And then the second question is how soon after that for the next one?
it's proposed to be annual after that.
Annually meaning first of the year or fiscal year?
Calendar year normally, because we like to make, it's better to make rate adjustments in the winter when people are at their lower water use and have more chance to. So we would suggest rate adjustments that are taking effect in January or February. I think one of the scenarios that we have outlined for you is to do the rate revision just to address the cost of service realignment. This, January or February of 2025, and then look at the first rate adjustment, basically January, February of 2026. Is that correct?
That assumed July 1, so I would recommend that you combine the first quarter 2025 calendar year, whether that's February, or you might need a little extra time if you're changing the rate structure. I don't know. That include the first revenue increase too. I think that would make sense. And I would say that with respect to the amount of the revenue increase, we showed you the bills with the 7.3% overall, and some of those bill increases with the rate structure change were double digits, 12, 13, 15%. So if that goes up to 10%, some of those may go over 20%. That's just something to keep in mind. Because the first rate increase is changing everything, the cost of service, the rate structure, and doing that revenue increase. So it's great to go out strong, and there will be compounding impacts of those changes.
So I'm going to take my own crack at this, which I think is pretty much what Councilor McLaughlin said. I'd propose directing staff to assume 3 million in SIP, a low growth industrial use. Yes to reallocating the rates based on cost of service, lowering residential use or the base rate to 7,500 gallons a month, keeping the non-residential use base rate at 5,000 gallons, and rate increase in the first quarter of 2025 based on the COS.
What?
Rate increase based on the calculations that we saw. So the 7.3. The low growth, yeah.
I said 10, you're saying 7.3.
In the additional research that you said you folks are going to be doing or taking it out, were you taking it out to the public or whatever it is you were doing on? I'm just wondering, is there some number that's going to help you with what would be a good initial increase? Because I have no clue. Could be 10, could be more. But at like 6.5 to 10 and come back with a number which we could really hone in on?
Good feel for what a good number would be. I think anything different than 0 is going to generate conversation.
Yeah.
But I think, we've made a pretty good case for the scenarios that we've presented, and the scenario that Councilor Richardson just identified is one of the scenarios that we have in the packet for you. So we can see what those rates are. And if it'd be helpful, we can actually review that slide again. But directly to answer your question, I don't think we have a good feel for what a preferred number would be in terms of the public's view.
Well, speaking to my fellow counselors, your 7.3 is an overall rate increase. It's not
An
everyone
overall
across
revenue increase.
revenue increase. So some people actually see a little downward. I mean,
Low water use residential customers would see a bill decrease under that scenario.
this next year, and then
Another bullet point.
It's not a lot, but it's also not, an increase.
7.5 number just sounds so good to me on the gallons. Why not use that for the rate increase too? And it's easy to remember them all.
Oh, yeah.
well, we're realigning it so the big guys pay more of the bill.
Okay.
So again, talking about your bullet points, there's a good one.
Darcy.
Right?
Oh,
Yeah, Counselor Long, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just gonna say that it's gonna be really helpful to understand how all the different things come together, what the cumulative rate is gonna be. I mean, it's been talked about that we don't exactly know how it's gonna affect people on average. And so as we come up with the number that we're looking at, I'd really like to see how that's gonna impact most people, just so I have a real sense of how it impacts people and not just numbers and percentages.
Do you have a preference, or do you have what's your attitude about what Counselor Richardson has suggested? Not that, sounds like him and Counselor McLaughlin are pretty close together here.
Yeah, I think they are pretty close together. I think, I don't know. I mean, I was leaning toward probably matching up with the other jurisdictions and going to 0 on the commercial. Because I think that some people probably would still pay less, even though it was showing on average, some people would pay more. That's the only difference that I'm thinking. And then I don't know what the rate increase is, but it probably, for me, it's like backing into it when we, put the 3 million in SIP in and we do the other adjustments we just talked about. Then I want to know what the rate ends up being.
What about the initial rate increase that Dan has suggested 7.3% to go along with?
That's
Well,
that's the overall revenue increase. It's not the customer bill.
Correct, yeah,
change.
the revenue increase of 7.3%, and seeing what the effect of that would be on an average bill for.
Well, I mean, they have a model here, right?
Oh,
A typical bill goes.
I think we have
up
that
2.1.
information on page 35.
Mhm.
Let me
Yeah.
check and see if the page number is different.
35, 37.
So I'm really visual, so I'm trying to put all these moving parts together, and plus I'm really sick, so that doesn't help at all. But what I'm worried about is that the first initial rate increase plus all the adjustments to, the minimums and all of that, I'm worried that it might make a really big increase for someone and that might be hard to swallow. I just want to make sure that that's not an unintended consequence. I think we want to get ahead of it as soon as we can, and it's going to sting a little, but I don't want to make it so that our businesses suffer from this. They've got a lot going on right now. So.
Agreed.
Page 37 does not assume
Go ahead.
the 3 million, or does not assume the cost of the infrastructure improvements, right?
Go ahead.
So we have the scenario that was just discussed, the 3 million SIP, the low usage, low industrial, the cost of service, the 7.5 base quantity on this slide right here. It's may have a different number in your packet because your packet didn't have the comparisons in it. It should be page 37. And this has the initial 7.3 increase. So this shows everything included. If you look at that FY 25, 26, and we're just saying that would actually be adopted in the first quarter of 2025, so it would be fiscal year 25. But those are the impacts for those different usage levels. So it gives you pretty much the broad spectrum.
So page 37
Thank you.
reflects exactly what Counselor Richardson is suggesting.
Exactly. Now, to look at the non-residential, though, then you have to advance a few slides and I think what she was saying was the zero. So this was so there's the zero. That's which page in their packet? 41.
Which 41?
Yeah. And obviously more significant increases because of the change in the cost of service and the elimination in this scenario of the zero of the minimum quantity.
Counselor Randall, you have anything you want to opine?
I think I'm in agreement with most of the the 7,500 for the water, the base usage, the 3 million, the 7% ballpark rate increase. The biggest hang up I have is the industrial use. I assume as these data centers come online, the use is going to increase dramatically. But then as they are up and running, I would also assume that they are going to look for ways to reduce their usage. Do you think that would have any impact on the long term, I guess, industrial use as they look for ways to conserve and reduce the amount of water they need?
Yeah, Councilor Randall, that's a really good point. It's something we've actually talked about in our amongst our project team, that we wanted to be cognizant of the fact that if we tried to, really dramatically increase the charges too much to the industrial users, they're going to find a way to use a lot less water. And, then that means other users are going to pick up more of the tab. I think we've struck a good balance, though, in the scenarios that we've presented to you, that we're basically, we're paying for a bunch of projects, but we're also accounting for inflation, and the rates that we have in here are not unusual rates that they would experience anywhere else, for example, or that would be enough of an increase each year to really drive them to implement other technology. Now, that's our opinion, but that is a concern that we were, discussing while we were developing these rate scenarios. So, Brian or Emily, anybody else have any other comments on that?
Can't hear.
Well, just to be the devil's advocate here, like we don't like rates going up, but we also don't like water usage being too high. And we've been talking about conserving. And so it's maybe not the worst thing in the world that if over time our industrial users use a lot less water here where we're suffering from a drought. And that gives us time to adjust our technology or our rates slowly over time to adjust for that.
There was one thing that you requested of us is the cost of service analysis approval. And in reflection of what I've heard tonight and what I've read, I'm in agreement with what you're doing with all of the development. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And I think we heard in the motion, or in the suggested motion, to adopt that cost of service.
Yes.
So thank you for that.
All right.
I think there's two things maybe we haven't heard yet, is some suggestion or direction in this motion for the amount of water to be included in the non-residential rate, the 0 or 5,000 gallon. Do you have a preference there?
I don't.
And if it's helpful, and maybe you can summarize one more time, the zero base non-residential rate structure would result in a higher increase for those users than the 5,000. Is that correct?
Well, if you compare slide 40 and
41.
41, for the smallest bill, they would actually go down under the zero, right? Steve and I.
I think it's under the,
Okay, wait,
under
sorry.
the 5 base, they were.
Under the yeah, so we only showed, as the small user, we've defined that as an 8,000 gallons, but if you want to talk about that's more like an average for the 3/4 inch. If you want to talk about a small user who's using less than 5, then they're, if we go to 0, the base charge goes down, but then they're going to be actually charged for some of the volume. So we haven't developed the full, I mean, I've got a table that's got, different usage levels, and I could certainly share more information on the bill impacts of those 2 options, and maybe that would help. Maybe we're not at a point where we can make that
So the
decision
5
yet.
base for non-residential, again, supports the smallest businesses, which is why
User.
if I were to be asked my opinion, I say I'm not changing my mind on that. I think we should have it.
Here's, mine is to minimize the impact rate increase for senior population. That's where I'm going to focus.
I'm fine with leaving the non-residential base at 5.
General consensus on that. And then
So I
just
think the
SDC.
very last thing, unless I'm forgetting something, is some direction on SDCs. Currently, we're at $2,317. The methodology would allow us to charge something up over $9,000. Is there an appetite for something like doubling what we currently have? Again, we're really low compared to other communities on our SDCs, even when Parks is considered, which is, an SDC that's larger than the city's 4 SDCs combined.
Well, assuming that an increase could stifle development, there could be that perception. And if we did raise SDCs, the revenues generated would make a minimal, if any, if zero impact on everything we've been talking about. I'm just throwing that out.
I would also add that we're completing a housing production strategies effort here too, and there has been some comment about different tiers and whatnot when it comes to SDCs that we might want to fold into this at some point.
And so I think, if I agree with that, and that might warrant some additional discussion. What we though have available to us now is a methodology that identifies what the maximum could be within that future conversation. Do you want to, another option is to leave SDCs alone right now. We know that we could charge as much as, whatever the number was, 9,000 or some dollars. I think the point was made earlier that there's limited amount of land yet to develop. This plan, I will point out, identifies all lands within the urban growth area, not just the city limits. So there's a little bit more opportunity than we might otherwise assume. With some of the housing strategy and some of the state legislation that allows 2 houses on any single lot now anymore, there's quite a bit of opportunity for some infill. Those are the things that would result in the city collecting SDCs.
So how do the rest of you feel about SDCs?
I think we should leave them alone for right now and decide those
too.
based on our housing production strategy.
I agree with that. That sounds like a good plan. I think we can always address that later.
I agree.
Yeah, if you don't have anybody coming in, that you can put whatever charge you want to on the piece of paper, but if nobody's buying it. So I'm not really in favor of doing SDCs at this point, but I think it's something we could look at down the road. The fact that we're lower than a lot of maybe similar sized communities, but we're not seeing the growth in that area maybe that those communities are, means we need all the attractions we can get. And SDCs might be one of those attractions being lower.
And maybe I will just ask a clarifying question to Deb. So if we leave the SDC rate the same for the 3/4 inch meter, should we also be asking whether we want to do the reallocation?
And changing the way the industrial.
Yeah, so that new larger developments would be paying a larger, and I think there's a slide that identifies a revised allocation or factor, adjustment factor as you go up through the meter sizes. They're interesting. You can see right now on the slide that's up, a 6-inch meter is 50 times the 50 units compared to a 3/4 inch meter, which is 1 unit. If we were to adopt current industry standards, that 6-inch meter would be twice as much as it is now. Is there appetite for updating the factors used in our SDCs and commercial rates, or keep the factors the same? If we don't do it for the commercial rates, it really affects your analysis, doesn't it? We've assumed that these factors will be identified in the rates, didn't you?
Well, we did assume some increase in revenue receipts, which we will have to
Well, no,
adjust.
for the monthly base rate though,
Oh, we can still use the same factors.
Okay.
I mean, we can update the factors on the rates
Okay.
without updating them on the SDCs, though,
okay.
you know.
So I guess just the question, is there interest in updating the factors used to calculate SDCs to make them consistent with rates, or leave the factors alone too?
Leave the residential
Leave the residential.
size alone and
Residential was actually really
Lower.
close already, yeah,
It's
and it
actually
would have gone
lower.
down, it would have gone down for big residential.
I wouldn't have a problem if you seemed to see a need to raise the larger size units up there, but how much, I don't know.
That's not a housing question.
No. That's commercial.
Agreed with that.
I agree with that as well.
Bring back a rate structure where we adjust the factors? Or leave?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. I think
That's how.
that was the last point of direction. Is anybody thinking of anything else?
But you didn't think you'd get a consensus like this tonight, did you?
I very much thank you for that.
We thank you for all your work. You guys, you, Dave, and the consultants, you guys have all done a terrific job.
The heavy lifting for these last 3 presentations have been done right here. And we keep throwing more scenarios at her up to this point. So using the direction we got tonight, we'll put that into a financial plan as a piece of the larger master plan. As I think I mentioned before, we hope to have that drafted and available for public review, posted for public review in November. We'll be bringing the plan before the city council in the form of a public hearing, staff report and a public hearing on December 9th. Council will have an opportunity to adopt the plan that night after the public hearing, if they so choose. If the council decides want more time to consider it, we would reschedule the actual adoption based on whatever direction we receive from the council, or probably January.
What is the public comment period again?
We're hoping we'll have this out in early November or mid-November? Mid-November? So
Okay.
between there and November and December 9th.
December 9th. Okay, so roughly November 15th, something like that. Okay.
I appreciate the scenarios and the working through of the many piles of numbers, but when we get to a public presentation, we're going to need to have it really clean. And, a couple of examples, right? If I'm the typical user, here's what happened. If I'm going to start a business, here's what happens.
We will only, we'll only provide those examples for the scenario that was just given to us. Just
What about the public relations piece of this? How does that fit in, and timing wise and substance wise?
So that has been underway for a while, and I think we're going to see some culmination of that as early as next week.
Good.
be able to.
So
start
well, in
getting ahead
well,
of
in
this.
at least in advance of the public comment period, which starts in mid-November.
And then so we have a cross-functional team that's been working on that. Amy's been a part of that, some staffers out at Public Works, Jill and Eric. Dave and I will be meeting with that team to review some of their work product and incorporating a lot of the comments we heard tonight and the direction that we received. Kind of a very broad overview is there's a couple different focus areas, if you will. One area would be on enterprise zone and SIP, kind of separate on its own. The other would be the existing and kind of more educational and informative around our existing water system, what we need and what some of those efforts are. And then that third piece is kind of how those first two kind of pull together and how those revenues are being used and how that is being used in these rate discussions, not only from SIP, as Mr. Anderson mentioned a moment ago, but the overall picture of water revenues and the different assets that we've received in our building and kind of coalescing those together. So I think at the very least, the water master plan or the water system educational piece will be rolling out. Maybe some elements of the SIP and enterprise zone agreements as, again, those educational pieces. And then moving forward with the water master plan and some of the rate information as we finalize that, incorporating that.
The talking points that Councilor Runyon mentioned a while ago are exactly what we're working on. Those are the exact messages that we've been crafting.
Okay. So we have a direction and the staff has direction. And we'll look forward to seeing the what Matthew just described as soon as possible. And we'll reconvene here about this issue on December 9th, I guess.
December 9th with a discussion about the whole plan.
Yeah. And then we'll be
Had three
monitoring,
work sessions on just the financial piece, but that's really the hard part, right?
how do people comment publicly during that public comment period, the 3 weeks or so? How do they comment? Will there be a public hearing?
So there'll be a public hearing at that meeting and we'll
November
of course be
or
announcing
December
that.
9th.
And then with our messaging, we'll be letting folks know that the plan's available for a review and how to submit comments
By December 9th.
by December 9th. And then we can also take comments on December 9th.
And then people can write in before that and we'll have copies of all the comments and okay. Any other questions? Comments? Okay, any reason we shouldn't adjourn at 8:31?
I apologize. We thought we'd get there by 8.
They're buying the beer.
Thank you.